Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name's Rick Matthews, and I'm 42. What I'm about to lay on you happened last fall. We took this trip, a family bonding thing. It wasn't supposed to turn out like this, not at all. Now, I'm waking up in cold sweats, jumping at every little noise, checking every damn shadow in my own house. It's been months, but I can't shake this feeling, like something followed us back from that trip. It all started when I cooked up this idea to take the family to Crimson Ridge, Ghost Town State Park in Montana. See, I've always been a history buff, and I figured showing my wife, Sarah, and the kids some old mining ruins would be a blast. Plus, with everyone glued to their phones and social media and work, I thought some time off grid would do us all some good. Sarah, my wife, was totally on board from the get-go. She's 39, and the most optimistic person you'll ever meet. Though, she does have this habit of brushing stuff off that maybe she shouldn't. My son, Ethan, well, he wasn't exactly thrilled. He's 16 and sarcasm is practically his first language. The idea of a weekend without Wi-Fi was basically his worst nightmare. Lily, our 10-year-old, she was the only one who was genuinely excited. She's got this wild imagination and loves ghost stories, so the thought of exploring a real ghost town lit her up like a Christmas tree. So, we packed up our old RV, we call her the Wanderer, and made the drive deep into the heart of Montana. The further we got from civilization, the quieter it got. Like seriously quiet. By the time we rolled into the park, the silence was almost deafening. Crimson Ridge isn't much more than a bunch of crumbling buildings and some scattered mining equipment. It's perched way up in the mountains, with these thick pine forests all around it. The air was crisp and cold when we pulled into the nearly empty campground. A ranger, kind of a grizzled-looking dude, greeted us as we parked. He was friendly enough, but also had this slightly warning tone. He handed us a map and then added, "Stick to the main paths. It's easy to get turned around out here in the weather. It can change on a dime. And, locals say this place has its fair share of visitors." He chuckled, but his eyes lingered on me for just a second too long. Creepy, right? We set up camp, and the first day was pretty uneventful. The kids poked around the ruins while Sarah and I just soaked up the scenery. By sunset it got freezing, so we huddled around a fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Lily kept begging for a ghost story, but Ethan just rolled his eyes. "This place is already creepy enough without you egging her on," he muttered. That night, I woke up to a noise outside the Wanderer. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. I nudged Sarah, but she just mumbled something about the wind and rolled over. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked out the window. The forest was still, the ruins were bathed in moonlight, and nothing seemed out of place. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I told myself it was just my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. No such luck. The next day, things started to get weird. Ethan swore he saw someone watching us from one of the crumbling buildings. He pointed it out while we were exploring, but by the time I looked, whoever it was gone. I brushed it off as his imagination, but Ethan's mood totally shifted. He stopped cracking jokes and kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to jump out at him. Later, Lily came running up to us, clutching this drawing she'd made. It was of the ghost town, but in the windows of the ruins, she'd sketched these shadowy figures with hollow eyes. "These are the people who lived here," she said, all matter-of-factly. "They're still watching." "Where did you get that idea, honey?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice light, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "I saw them last night," Lily said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Sarah shot me a look, one that clearly said, "Are you sure this trip was a good idea?" That night, the whispers came again, but this time they were louder. It was like they were circling the wanderer, getting closer, then fading away, then closer again. I stayed awake for hours, gripping that flashlight like it was a lifeline, listening to every little creak and groan. Then, around 3:00 a.m., I heard something heavier footsteps, but not human footsteps. These were deliberate, slow, and heavy, like boots dragging through gravel. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. The third day, Ethan was completely different. He was pale, distant, and when I asked if he was okay, he just shrugged me off. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. That evening, Sarah found him outside the Wanderer, just staring off at the ruins. His face was blank, his eyes were glassy. When she called his name, he didn't even flinch. I had to physically shake him to snap him out of it. "They're calling me," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to go." He didn't remember saying any of that later, but I could tell he was shaken to his core. He spent the rest of the day holed up in the RV, refusing to come out. That night was the worst. The whispers were so loud, it sounded like a whole crowd murmuring just outside. Then came the scratching. At first, it was light, like an animal pawing at the RV. But then it grew louder, deeper, like something was trying to claw its way through the door. I grabbed the shotgun I'd brought along, just in case, and yanked open the door. Nothing. Absolutely nothing was there. But on the door, there were 3 deep scratches, long and jagged, as if something had tried to force its way in. Lily disappeared the next morning. One minute she was there, sitting by the fire, and the next she was just gone. We called her name, our voices echoing through the stillness of the ghost town. We searched the ruins, scoured the woods, our panic rising with every passing second. There was no sign of her, not a trace. Finally, we found her. She was in an old cabin at the edge of town, standing in the corner, staring at the wall. "Lily," Sarah cried, running to her, relief flooding through her voice. Lily turned slowly. Her face was blank, her eyes distant, just like Ethan's had been. "They're here," she said softly, her voice hollow. "They're watching." That was it. We were out of there. We packed up faster than I thought humanly possible. But then, the Wanderer wouldn't start. The engine, which had been working perfectly just days ago, refused to turn over. I worked on it for what felt like hours, my hands shaking, the whispers growing louder, closer. It felt like they were closing in on us. Finally, I managed to hotwire the damn thing. Thank God for those old survival shows I used to watch. We tore out of there, leaving Crimson Ridge and its silent watchers behind, a cloud of dust in our wake. Days later, back home, safe and sound, or so we thought, I found one of Lily's drawings tucked into my jacket pocket. It was a picture of our family, standing in front of the Wanderer, all smiles. But behind us, in the shadows, were those same hollow-eyed figures she'd drawn before. I don't know what we brought back with us from Crimson Ridge, but I know it's still here. I see them sometimes in the corners of my vision, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, watching. Sarah tries to pretend everything's normal. She says it's just our imaginations, the stress of the trip, playing tricks on us. But I see the way she jumps at sudden noises, the way she constantly checks the locks on the doors and windows. She knows it too, deep down. Ethan's changed. He's quieter now, more withdrawn. He doesn't talk about what happened at the ghost town, not to me, not to Sarah, not to anyone. But sometimes, I catch him staring out the window, his eyes fixed on something I can't see, a flicker of that same blank, distant look he had at Crimson Ridge. And Lily, she's not the same either. She still draws, but the whimsical ghost stories and colorful landscapes are gone. Now, it's all those figures, those shadowy things with the hollow eyes, always watching, always lurking. She doesn't talk about them, but they're there, in every picture, a constant, silent presence. We try to move on, to forget about what happened, but it's like Crimson Ridge left a stain on us, a darkness we can't wash away. The whispers are fainter now, but they still come sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that cold dread creep up my spine, that feeling of being watched, of something unseen standing just behind me. I don't know what those things were, or what they wanted, but I know this: we weren't supposed to disturb them. We went looking for a ghost town, for a bit of adventure, a break from the everyday. But we found something else, something that followed us home, something that's still here, lurking just beyond the light, waiting. And I don't know if we'll ever truly be free of it. All right, let me tell you about the time I almost died. Or maybe I did. I don't even know anymore. It's been a few years, but the whole thing still messes me up. My name is Chloe Adams, and I was 35 when my life turned into a freaking horror movie. It was late October, that time when everything's pumpkin spice and spooky decorations. My boyfriend, Mark, got this bright idea to rent a cabin up in Montana. Said it'd be romantic, a chance for us to reconnect. His word, not mine. Things between us had been kinda rocky. We were like two ships passing in the night, barely talking beyond. How was your day? And what's for dinner? To be honest, I was hoping this trip might fix us, or at least give us a chance to talk about fixing us. Mark found this place on Airbnb, called it Rustic Charm. Sounded corny, but the pictures looked decent: secluded cabin, mountain views, the whole 9 yards. He was stoked about the no neighbors, for miles apart. He's a photographer and figured he'd get some killer shots. I was less thrilled about being in the middle of nowhere. But whatever, I went along with it. Then, at the last minute, Mark suggests we invite my best friend, Lisa. See, Lisa had just gotten dumped hard. She was a mess, crying all the time, the whole shebang. I guess Mark thought a change of scenery would do her good. I wasn't exactly jumping for joy at the idea of turning our romantic getaway into a group trip, especially with a heartbroken third wheel. But Lisa seemed genuinely excited, so I caved. We packed up Mark's SUV and hit the road. The drive up there was long but pretty. We were way out in the boonies, surrounded by these massive pine trees that seemed to go on forever. When we finally found the cabin, though, my stomach did a little flip-flop. It wasn't exactly like the pictures. It was smaller, older, and way creepier. The porch was sagging, the shutters were banging in the wind, and the whole place just felt off. Plus, there was this overgrown path next to it that led to a freaking graveyard. Yeah, a graveyard, complete with crooked, moss-covered headstones. Talk about setting the mood. This old guy, Jerry, was waiting for us. He was the Airbnb host, apparently. He was kinda gruff, with these intense eyes that seemed to stare right through you. He showed us around, explaining how to use the wood stove and the generator. Before he left, he paused at the door, looked us dead in the eyes, and said, "Stay close to the cabin at night. The woods around here, they ain't friendly." Mark laughed it off, calling it cold man superstition, but Jerry's words stuck with me. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. It felt like a warning, or maybe even a plea. That first night, we tried to make the best of it. We cooked dinner, played some cards, and Lisa even managed to crack a few jokes about her ex. But even then, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was the long drive and the creepy atmosphere getting to me. But when I went to bed, I dreamt of dark shapes moving through the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. It felt way too real to be just a dream. And that was only the beginning. The next day, we decided to go for a hike. Mark was in his element, snapping pictures of everything: trees, mountains, even a damn squirrel. Lisa seemed a bit better too, laughing and joking like her old self. It was almost like the creepy cabin and the whole being watched feeling was just in my head. Almost. But as the sun started going down, the whole vibe shifted. The forest got darker, colder, and that silence I mentioned before. It came back, thick and heavy, like a blanket smothering every sound. It was seriously freaking me out. That night, things started to get really weird. Around midnight, I woke up to this scratching sound. At first it was faint, like branches brushing against the window. But then it got louder, more insistent. "Scratch. Scratch. Mark," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "It's just the wind, Kilo. Go back to sleep." But it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded deliberate, like something was trying to get in. I got up and peeked through the curtains, but all I could see was darkness. The scratching stopped the second I moved. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Not a wink. The next morning, Lisa woke up with this weird bruise on her arm. It was dark purple, and it was shaped like a handprint, like someone had grabbed her really hard. She just laughed it off, saying she must have slept funny, but it seriously freaked me out. How do you get a handprint bruise from sleeping? Later, as we were getting ready to go for another hike, I noticed something else. There were these symbols carved into the door frame of the cabin. They were crude and jagged, like someone had scratched them into the wood with a knife. They looked ancient, almost tribal. "Did you see these yesterday?" I asked Mark, pointing them out. He squinted at them, probably just some kids messing around. "Don't worry about it." But I was worried. Those symbols felt wrong. They felt like they were meant to keep something out, or maybe invite something in. Either way, it wasn't good. I had this growing sense of dread, like something bad was about to happen. That night was when things really went off the rails. I woke up again to that damn scratching, but this time it was way louder, more aggressive. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman outside the window. She was wearing a tattered white dress, and her long, dark hair was all matted and tangled. She was standing so close that her breath fogged up the glass. But her eyes, God, her eyes, they were just black holes, empty and endless. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed my lungs out. Mark and Lisa bolted upright, and I pointed to the window, yelling about the woman. Mark grabbed a flashlight and flicked it on. But when the light hit the window, she was gone. There were no footprints outside, no sign that anyone had been there. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. It was her. I stammered, my voice shaking. The woman in the white dress. She was right there. Mark looked at me like I was losing it. "Hello, there's no one out here. You're just spooked. Let's all go back to bed." But how could I go back to bed after that? I knew what I'd seen, and I knew, deep down, that we weren't safe in that cabin. Not anymore. The next day, Lisa, of all people, suggested we check out the graveyard. I guess she was trying to lighten the mood or something, but seriously, after everything that had happened, I definitely didn't want to go anywhere near that creepy place. But Mark, always the adventurer, sided with her. He said it would be a good distraction. Fine. Whatever. The graveyard was even worse up close. The headstones were ancient, covered in moss and lichen. Some of them tilted at crazy angles. One of them had the name, Margaret Holloway, carved into it, along with the date 1873. Most of the others were too worn to read. It was like stepping into a ghost story. As we were turning to leave, Lisa stopped. "Wait," she said, pointing. "What's that?" She was pointing to a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. It was barely visible, hidden behind a tangle of bushes. Before I could even protest, she started walking down it, like she was in some kind of trance. Mark, ever the dutiful photographer, followed her, probably hoping for some atmospheric shots. I reluctantly followed, my heart pounding with every step. The air got colder the further we went, and that heavy silence pressed down on us again. The path ended at a small cave, its entrance hidden by thick vines. Inside the cave, it was even creepier. There were more of those strange symbols carved into the walls, and hanging from the ceiling was a tattered white dress. It was identical to the one I'd seen on the woman outside the window. Lisa reached for the dress, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't touch it." "Why not?" she said, laughing. "It's just an old dress." "Please," I begged. "Let's just go. This place is bad news." She rolled her eyes but followed me out of the cave. As we walked back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Lisa's footsteps weren't making any sound. It was like the forest was swallowing the noise, leaving only that oppressive silence. That night, Lisa started acting really strange. She was restless and irritable, snapping at Mark and me over nothing. When I tried to talk to her, she accused me of being paranoid and ruining the trip. Later, I heard her talking in her room, like she was having a conversation with someone. But when I opened the door, she was alone. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes dark and glassy. "No one," she said. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. Something was seriously wrong with Lisa. It was like she wasn't even herself anymore. It was like that place, that cave, had done something to her, changed her. And I was terrified to find out what. The next morning, Lisa was gone. Her bed was empty, and all her stuff was still in the cabin. We found her footprints leading towards the graveyard, but halfway there, they just stopped, vanished, like she'd been plucked right out of thin air. Mark wanted to call for help, but of course, the generator had decided to crap out on us, and neither of our phones had any signal. We were totally screwed. We spent the whole day searching the woods, calling Lisa's name until our voices were raw. It was hopeless. It was like the forest had just swallowed her whole. As the sun started to set, we dragged ourselves back to the cabin, defeated and terrified. And that's when we saw her again, the woman in white. She was standing in the graveyard, her hollow eyes fixed on us. Mark, in a fit of rage and desperation, grabbed a flashlight and stormed towards her, yelling and demanding to know what she'd done with Lisa. But as he got closer, she just disappeared, vanished into the shadows. And in the spot where she'd been standing, draped over a headstone, was the tattered white dress from the cave. "We're leaving," I said, my voice trembling. "No." Mark didn't argue. He was pale and shaking, his bravado completely gone. We threw our stuff in the car, not even bothering to pack properly, and sped away from that cursed cabin. As we reached the main road, I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw it. The cabin was on fire. Flames were licking the sky, turning the night a hellish orange, and in the glow of the fire I saw her, the woman in white, standing motionless, watching us leave. We never found Lisa. She became another unsolved mystery, another whispered legend in that area. They started calling it Red Moon Ridge, a place to avoid, a place of missing persons and unexplained phenomena. As for me, I moved far away from Montana. I try not to think about what happened, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear scratching at my window, and I see those black, empty eyes staring back at me. And I wonder if she's finally come for me. I wonder if anyone can ever truly escape the darkness of Red Moon Ridge. I wonder if Lisa is still trapped there, somewhere in that endless forest, lost and alone. And I wonder if the scratching will ever stop. It's been 3 years since that trip to the Bitterroot National Forest, but the memories are still fresh, like a wound that won't heal. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I was 29 when it all went down. I'm 32 now, but some days it feels like I'm still stuck in those woods. It's not something I talk about easily, but I need to get it out. This isn't just my story, it's a warning. There's something evil out there, and I pray you never cross its path. It all started with my boyfriend at the time, Mark. He was 31, a total adrenaline junkie. The guy lived for adventure, which could be awesome but also super annoying sometimes. When he suggested a camping trip in Montana, I was like, hard pass. I'm more of a city girl, you know. But Mark had this way of getting you hyped up about things. He sold it as a way to unplug and get back to nature. I caved, but only if my best friend Chloe could come. She was 27, sarcastic as hell, and always had my back. I knew she wouldn't let things get too crazy. Mark invited his buddy, Ben, along. Ben was that guy who always had a joke ready, even when it wasn't appropriate. Underneath the humor, though, he was a nervous wreck, like he never quite fit in anywhere. The more, the merrier, Mark said, grinning as he loaded up his beat-up UV with camping gear. That should have been my first clue that he wasn't taking this seriously. The drive to the Bitterroot was long, but at least it was pretty. Huge pine trees lined the winding road, and the air got colder the higher we went. Mark kept pointing out landmarks and spouting random facts about the area. This place is untouched, he said, practically bouncing in his seat. It'll be like stepping back in time. When we finally got to the campsite, my first thought was, wow, this is remote. We were miles from the nearest trailhead, and there wasn't another person in sight. The forest was all around us, thick and dark, even though it was still afternoon. Mark parked the SUV near a clearing by Willow Creek, a little stream that gurgled softly. We set up camp, a single, sad-looking tent and a pathetic excuse for a fire pit. Mark's gear was a mix of old hand-me-downs and cheap stuff from the dollar store. Chloe immediately started complaining. "This is amateur hour," she said, shaking her head as she tried to patch a rip in the tent with duct tape. "Did you even plan this, or are you just winging it?" "Relax, Chloe," Mark said with a grin. "It's all part of the adventure." That first night was freezing. The cold seeped into our sleeping bags, and the fire died out after like an hour. The next day, we hiked along the creek, and yeah, it was beautiful, I guess. But as the sun started to go down, I started feeling uneasy. It was like a prickling on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, not wanting to give Chloe any more ammo to complain. But that night, things changed. We were sitting around the fire, trying to stay warm, when we heard it for the first time, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Ben froze, his usual jokes gone, replaced by a nervous laugh. "Coyotes, maybe?" he suggested, but his voice cracked. Mark grabbed his flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said, standing up. "Like hell you will," Chloe snapped. "Whatever it is, it's none of our business." Mark hesitated but eventually sat back down. The wailing continued, sometimes faint, sometimes louder, like it was circling us. We huddled close to the fire, our nerves shot. When the noises finally stopped, none of us felt much like sleeping. The next morning, while Mark and Ben went to gather firewood, Chloe and I walked along the creek. That's when I found it, a pile of bones arranged in a perfect circle on the damp earth. They were small, maybe from a bird or a rabbit, but they were unnaturally clean, like they'd been bleached. "What the hell is this?" Chloe muttered, her voice low. "I don't know," I whispered, a chill running down my spine. We decided not to tell the guys. Chloe's logic was that it would only rile up Mark and freak out Ben. But I couldn't shake the image of those bones, or the feeling that someone or something had put them there on purpose. The unease I felt the day before was nothing compared to what came next. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows, Mark spotted her. We were by the creek, filling up our water bottles, when he suddenly stopped and pointed. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some weird reflection on the water. But then I saw her, an old woman, hunched over the creek, her back to us. She was wearing a tattered gray cloak that looked like it was made of cobwebs and dust. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was scooping water with her hands, though I couldn't see a bucket or any container. Mark called out, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness. The woman didn't react. Slowly, she straightened up and turned to face us. Her face was pale and deeply lined, like a dried-up river, but it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were milky white, completely blank, and they seemed to stare right through us, like we were ghosts. She raised one bony finger, gnarled and twisted like an old tree branch, and pointed it directly at me. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled backward, a silent scream trapped in my throat. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me away as the woman took a step back into the shadows. And then, just like that, she was gone, vanished. We ran back to camp, breathless and shaken. Mark tried to play it off, saying she was probably just some eccentric local, maybe a hermit living off the grid. But none of us bought it. Not after the way she looked at me. Not after the way she disappeared. That night, the wailing returned, but this time it was louder, closer. It felt like it was right outside our tent. I peeked out from under the flap, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw them, wet footprints leading from the creek to the edge of our campsite. They stopped just outside my side of the tent. Someone or something had been standing there, watching me sleep. The next morning, we woke up to a new horror. Ben was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots missing. We searched the area around the camp, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. But the forest was eerily silent. It was like it had swallowed him whole. Then we found his flashlight, lying in the mud near the creek. The beam was still on, casting a weak, flickering light that seemed to mock our desperation. Beside it was one of his boots, soaked and torn, like it had been ripped off his foot. "We need to leave," Chloe said, her voice shaking, but her eyes hard with determination. "No." Mark hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Ben and the growing realization that we were in way over our heads. "We can't just leave him," he argued, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his fear. What if he's hurt? What if he's lost? What if he's dead? Close snap, the words hanging heavy in the air, a brutal truth we couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, Mark agreed to pack up. But as we were loading the SUV, I felt a strange pull toward the creek. It was like something was calling to me, a soft whisper on the edge of my hearing. I tried to ignore it, to focus on getting the hell out of there, but then I turned, and I saw her again. The old woman was standing on the opposite bank of the creek, her hollow eyes fixed on me, and behind her, half hidden in the shadows, was Ben. He was pale and motionless, his eyes wide and vacant, his face twisted in a silent scream of terror. "Ben," I screamed, my voice cracking. But Mark grabbed me, dragging me toward the car. "He's gone, Sarah," he said firmly, his voice thick with a grief he was trying to suppress. "We can't help him." As we sped away from that cursed campsite, the whispers turned to screams. They weren't just in my head anymore. I could hear them echoing through the trees, a chorus of the damned. The forest, once beautiful, now seemed menacing, the trees closing in on us like grasping claws. I looked back one last time, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The old woman was still there, watching us, a cruel smile twisting her withered lips. It was a smile that promised pain, a smile that said, "You can run, but you can't hide." Ben was never found. The authorities, a bunch of jaded park rangers and a bored-looking sheriff, dismissed our story as mass hysteria. They said Ben probably got lost, fell into a ravine, or was attacked by a wild animal. They blamed the treacherous terrain and our overactive imaginations. They didn't see what we saw. They didn't hear the screams. They didn't feel the icy grip of that ancient evil. Mark and I broke up not long after. We didn't talk about it. But that trip changed us. The unspoken truth hung between us like a shroud. We couldn't look at each other without remembering the terror, without seeing Ben's vacant eyes staring out from the shadows. Chloe, tough as nails Chloe, refused to talk about it at all. She shut down, buried it deep. But I saw the way she sometimes started at sudden noises, the way her eyes darted to the shadows, always searching, always afraid. As for me, I tried to move on. I really did. I got a new apartment, a new job, tried to build a new life. But the dreams wouldn't let me. They came every night, relentless and vivid. I'd see the old woman, her milky eyes boring into mine, her bony finger pointing, always pointing. I'd hear her whispering my name, a raspy incantation that slithered into my soul. And sometimes, when I was alone, I'd hear Ben's voice. It was faint and pleading, calling to me from somewhere I couldn't reach. It was a constant, agonizing reminder of my failure, of the friend I left behind. It broke my heart, every single day, hearing him call out to me, and me being helpless to do a thing. The fear became a part of me, a constant companion. I'd find myself checking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for a pair of glowing white eyes. I'd jump at the slightest sound, my heart leaping into my throat. I became a prisoner of my own fear, trapped in a cycle of terror and regret. People tried to help, tried to tell me that it was all in my head. "It was just a bad dream, Sarah," they'd say. "You need to move on." But they didn't understand. It wasn't just a dream. It was a curse. I started seeing a therapist, a kind, patient woman named Dr. Evans. She listened patiently as I poured out my story, the fear, the guilt, the nightmares. She told me I was suffering from PTSD, that the trauma had left deep scars on my psyche. She tried to teach me coping mechanisms, relaxation techniques, ways to manage the anxiety. It helped a little, but it didn't erase the memories. It didn't silence the whispers. It didn't bring Ben back. I knew, deep down, that I would never truly be free of that place, of that woman, of that evil. It was a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. I realized that all I could do was learn to live with it, to carry the burden, to bear the scars. It was a heavy price to pay for a weekend camping trip, a price I was still paying every single day. 3 years. 3 years of therapy, of trying to forget, of trying to heal. But the whispers never fade. They're always there, just below the surface, waiting to break through. Sometimes, it's a rustle of leaves that sounds like a raspy breath. Sometimes, it's a flicker of movement in the periphery that makes me think of an old woman in a tattered gray cloak. I've learned to live with the fear, the guilt, the nightmares. They're a part of me now, like an old, familiar ache. But I haven't given up. I keep searching for answers, for some way to understand what happened in those woods. I read books on folklore, on local legends, on anything that might shed light on the darkness we encountered. I've learned about the history of the Bitterroot National Forest, about the indigenous tribes that once lived there, about the dark whispers, and about the tales of a malevolent spirit, an ancient entity that dwells in the deepest parts of the woods. A she-demon, a devourer of souls, that lures unsuspecting travelers to their doom. A creature of pure evil who can be summoned through rituals and offerings, and some say she appears as an old woman, luring her victims to water before taking them. Some of the stories are eerily similar to what happened to us. The arranged bones, the wailing, the old woman by the water, they're all there, in the old legends, passed down through generations. It's chilling to think that we weren't just victims of some random act of violence, but part of something much older, something much darker. I know now that what we encountered wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. It was real, it was ancient, and it was evil. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that it's still out there waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into its domain, waiting to claim another victim. That's why I'm telling my story, not for sympathy, not for forgiveness, but as a warning. Heed the whispers. Stay away from the deep woods. Don't trust the shadows. And if you ever see an old woman by the water, an old woman with milky white eyes and a tattered gray cloak, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because some things are worse than death. Some things will haunt you forever. Some things will leave you trapped in an endless nightmare, a prisoner of your own fear. Trust me, I know. I'm living proof. And the whispers never fade. They're always there, a constant reminder of the evil that lurks in the darkness, waiting to claim its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I can still hear Ben's voice, calling to me from the shadows. And I know that a part of me will always be trapped in those woods, forever lost, forever haunted. forever screaming. But most of all, I know that I have to keep telling my story. I have to keep warning people. Because if I can save even one person from the fate that befell Ben, then maybe, just maybe, his death won't have been in vain. And maybe, just maybe, I can finally find some peace. My name is Sarah Walker, and I just turned 29 a few months back. This whole mess went down along the Beartooth Highway in Montana. Look, I need you to understand something right off the bat. I never asked for any of this. All I wanted was a simple trip into the wilderness, a chance to soak up some nature vibes and, yeah, maybe reconnect with my boyfriend, Mark. We'd been a little off lately, but instead of all that, I came back with nightmares that won't quit and this weird mark on my arm that just won't fade. Mark is 31, and we've been together for about 2 years. He's the adventurous type, always pushing the limits and chasing thrills. Me, I'm more the planner type. Before we even left for Montana, I was the one packing extra blankets, batteries, a full-on first aid kit, you name it. Basically anything we might need if things went sideways. Mark just laughed it off, saying I worried too much. Maybe he was right, maybe I was being paranoid. But hey, I'm alive. So maybe those worries were worth something in the end, right? We ended up inviting Tom, Mark's childhood friend, along at the last minute. Tom was always a bit of a mystery, kind of quiet and brooding, with a past nobody really understood. He showed up at our place with a duffel bag, and this haunted look in his eyes. Honestly, I thought having him along might be a good thing, might help keep the peace between Mark and me. I figured if we were busy showing Tom a good time, maybe Mark and I wouldn't fight as much. Boy, was I wrong, but I didn't realize it then. So, we set out early one morning, the three of us crammed into Mark's beat-up RV. Let me tell you, that thing was not in the best shape. The battery sometimes died for no reason, and the generator had a habit of sputtering out at the worst possible times. Mark swore up and down it would be fine. We'll pick up a spare battery along the way, he said. But guess what? We never did. We were just too stoked to start our adventure, too caught up in proving we were these untamed spirits looking for the ultimate experience. The Beartooth Highway is a wild place, seriously stunning but also kind of terrifying. You've got these jagged peaks piercing the sky, and the roads twist and turn, hugging these crazy steep drop-offs. The wind up there can seriously rattle your nerves. One minute you're staring at this picture, perfect valley, and the next these thick clouds roll in and swallow everything up in mist. It's intense. We eventually found a spot off the main road, far enough to feel like we were really out there, but not so far that we were completely cut off, or so we thought. That first night, I tried to chill out by the campfire. Mark was in high spirits, talking about how we could do some fishing in the nearby streams. Tom, he just sat there, staring into the flames like he was trying to read the future or something. I asked him if he was okay, and he just nodded, real quiet like. I remember how hushed the mountains were that night. It was like the whole wilderness was holding its breath, watching us, sizing us up. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I shook it off. Mark and I crawled into the RV bed around midnight. I was still wide awake, though, my mind buzzing from the altitude and the quiet. Just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard this faint scraping noise along the side of the RV. My eyes snapped open. I waited, heart pounding, but it stopped. I told myself it was probably just a pine branch blowing in the wind. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, though, I found these deep scratches etched into the RV's paint. 3 long gouges, like some huge animal had tried to claw its way inside. Mark just shrugged it off, saying maybe a bear wandered by. He checked our food supplies, but nothing was disturbed. There's probably just a bear roaming the area, he repeated. No big deal. I wasn't convinced, not at all, but I kept my mouth shut. We decided to take a short hike, just to get a feel for the terrain. The hike was breathtaking, no lie. Tall pines, craggy boulders, and these glimpses of distant peaks that made you feel tiny. We heard the rush of a small river in the distance, which was kind of peaceful. Occasionally, we'd find boot prints in the dirt, so we knew other hikers had been there recently. Still, I couldn't shake this prickly feeling at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. Part of me wanted to turn back right then and there, but I didn't want to ruin the trip. Mark hated it when I got all cautious, so I bit my tongue and kept going, telling myself I was just being paranoid. On our way back to camp, that's when we saw it, a mangled animal carcass. A rabbit, I think. Its body was twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Its limbs were arranged almost deliberately, like some kind of sick ritual. Tom stared at it for the longest time, his eyes dark and unreadable. Mark tried to wave it off as a coyote kill, but even he looked uneasy. We buried the poor thing and hurried back to the RV without another word. That evening, we built a new campfire, trying to pretend everything was normal. But there was this argument simmering between Mark and me. I wanted to leave the next day. My gut was screaming at me that this place was wrong, that something was lurking in those woods. Mark accused me of being paranoid, of trying to spoil the adventure. We argued in hushed tones so Tom wouldn't hear, but I'm sure he did. Tom stayed silent, occasionally glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to emerge from the darkness. Eventually, Tom stood up and muttered something about gathering more firewood. He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the trees. Time ticked by, and Tom didn't come back. The darkness thickened, and the temperature dropped like a stone. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying this sound that set my teeth on edge, like distant laughter, but distorted, messed up. I told Mark we had to go after him. We set off with our lantern, calling Tom's name. Our voices echoed back at us from the towering pines, all spooky, like. After what felt like hours, we found his flashlight. It was lying in the moss, still on, its beam illuminating a set of massive, barefoot tracks in the mud. These tracks were way bigger than any humans, and they led deeper into the woods. A chill ran through me as I realized there were drag marks, too, as if something heavy had been pulled along. "Tom," Mark yelled, and his voice cracked with desperation. There was no answer, only the wind whistling through the trees. We followed the tracks for a while, but they vanished among rocks and leaves. The forest felt suffocating, like it was pressing in on us. Mark called Tom's name again, and this time, I swear I heard something call back. A faint voice that sounded like Tom, but off, twisted. We strained to listen, and the voice came again, seeming to beckon us forward. We ran in that direction, stumbling through thick undergrowth, but there was nothing. No sign of Tom, just a small clearing with a circle of stones in the center, like someone had set up a primitive fire pit ages ago. Mark shone the lantern around. Tall black trees loomed over us, their branches bristling like hostile spears. I felt like I was standing in a place humans were never meant to see. Then we heard the laughter, deep, guttural, and so close it made my heart lurch into my throat. Mark swung the lantern wildly, illuminating the face of something, or someone. At first, I thought it was just a person standing there, tall and thin, with skin stretched tight over bone. But then I realized its limbs were slightly too long, its eyes reflecting the lantern light like an animal's. It opened its mouth, and I heard that same laughter, reverberating with a horrible echo. Mark raised his rifle. He'd brought it along, of course, just in case, and fired once. The shot rang out, echoing through the mountains like a thunderclap. The creature jerked sideways, but the bullet must have missed because it moved with impossible speed, lunging at Mark. I shrieked, stumbled backward, and tripped over my own feet. The lantern fell and shattered, plunging us into near darkness, aside from the small circle of light from the moon. I scrambled for the flashlight we'd brought, but my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly grip it. When I finally got the flashlight beam steady, the creature was dragging Mark into the shadows. He screamed, twisting in its grip, his feet thrashing. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. I rushed forward, yelling his name, but the thing turned its head toward me, eyes burning. It let out a snarl, and Mark's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by this sickening silence. In that moment, all I could think was, this is it. This is where we die. But the creature let out another hiss, then vanished into the dark with Mark in its claws, as if the trees themselves swallowed them whole. I stood there, tears burning my eyes, frozen in shock. When my legs finally obeyed me, I ran. I ran without direction, stumbling and crying. I called Mark's name into the night, called Tom's too, but only the wind answered. Somehow I made it back to the RV, my chest heaving. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't even try to pack up our campsite. I just jumped into the driver's seat and fumbled for the keys, praying the battery was still working. The engine struggled to turn over, and for a second, I thought it was dead. My heart pounded. If the RV didn't start, I was as good as dead. Then, miraculously, it roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, bouncing over ruts and rocks as I tore out of there. I drove through the night, not daring to stop until I reached the closest ranger station at dawn. I burst in, babbling about monsters and missing people. The rangers gave me these skeptical looks, but they sent out a search party anyway. I tried to go with them, but I was too shaken to be of any help. They told me to rest, to wait. The next few days were a blur. The rangers returned with no sign of Mark or Tom, no trace of the creature, no footprints. Nothing. They assured me they would keep looking, but they had that look in their eyes, the one that said they thought I was hysterical. that maybe I'd had a breakdown. Eventually, I headed home alone, packing up the RV with trembling hands. I felt hollow inside, like part of me had been scooped out. Every time the wind blew or a tree branch scraped across a window, my skin prickled with the memory of that laughter. A week later, my phone rang. It was the ranger station. They'd found nothing but a rifle casing near our old campsite. No bodies, no blood, just an empty shell. They wanted me to come and identify the casing, see if it matched Mark's rifle. I didn't have the strength. I told them to mail it to me if they had to. Then I hung up. I've tried to resume a normal life, but everything reminds me of that night. Even the smallest noise in the dark sets my heart racing. I've taken to sleeping with every light on, or not sleeping at all. Sometimes I dream of the forest, and I hear that deep laughter echoing among the pines. Other times, I hear Mark's voice calling my name from just beyond the trees, begging me to help him. A month after I got home, I noticed a scratch on my arm. It was thin, almost like a paper cut, but it was in the same spot where I had seen a scratch on Mark the morning after we heard the first scraping on the RV. I'm sure I never injured myself there. It appeared overnight. At least, that's what I believe. Now, whenever I catch sight of that mark, I feel a strange tingling sensation, as if something is trying to burrow under my skin. I've told the authorities everything, but they have no answers. They say it's an open case, that they'll follow any leads, but no one calls me back anymore. It's like Mark and Tom never existed. It's like the wilderness swallowed them up, just like it tried to swallow me. I don't know if what took them was a spirit, a demon, or some twisted human being living out some dark fantasy. All I know is that something out there, in those mountains, wears a hideous face, leaves footprints too large for any normal man, and it can laugh. I'm 29 years old, and every night I'm reminded that there are places in this world where humans were never meant to tread. If you ever drive the Beartooth Highway, be careful. That thing might still be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next group of thrill seekers to wander too far from safety. And if you hear laughter that doesn't seem human, if you see footprints bigger than any you've seen before, don't ignore them like we did. My name is Sarah Walker, and this is the truth I have to live with now. I survived, but I'm not sure what's left of me is worth calling alive. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear Mark whispering outside my window, calling my name in a voice that sounds almost human. And I wonder if someday I'll answer, if I'll go outside and follow him into the dark. I pray to God that when I die, I won't meet that laughter again. But I can't shake this fear that it has marked me, that it's watching, biding its time, waiting for a moment of weakness. All I can do is cling to the last shred of hope I have. The hope that Mark's spirit has found some peace somewhere that monstrosity can't reach. As for me, I keep looking over my shoulder, never quite sure if I'll see the silhouette of something tall and gaunt on the horizon, smiling with too many teeth. I can only warn you, don't go looking for answers in places that were meant to remain wild. You might find them and lose yourself forever. My name is Alex Riley. I'm 27, And the whole mess I'm about to lay on you went down last summer up near the Blackfoot River in Montana. Now, before all this, I was the kind of guy who thought curses and witches were just stuff for scary movies. I mean, I figured the worst that could happen on a fishing trip was maybe a flat tire or a bear getting a little too curious about our snacks. Yeah, well, I was dead wrong. My best buddy Ben, who's 28, and I decided we needed a guy's weekend. Get away from it all. He was about ready to lose it at his office job, and I'd just broken up with my girlfriend, Sarah. The plan was simple. Drive out to some remote spot near the Blackfoot, set up our tent, fish all day, chill out at night, and just forget the real world for a couple of days. Ben picked the place 'cause he grew up in Montana and knew all the local stories, most of which I thought were just silly superstitions. So, we loaded up his beat-up old Jeep with all our gear, tents, rods, food, and Ben's just-in-case gun. He also brought along this little, worn-out journal that he wouldn't let me peek at. When I gave him a hard time about it, he just shrugged and said it was full of notes on local folklore he'd heard from his grandpa. I just rolled my eyes. I mean, the only thing I wanted to worry about was whether the fish were gonna bite. We got to the Blackfoot River by lunchtime. The sky was bright and clear, the water was all sparkly, and the pine trees along the bank were swaying in this gentle breeze. It was perfect. No crowds, no traffic, just us and the wilderness. We found this flat, grassy spot near the river's edge and parked. But while we were unloading our stuff, we hit our first snag. The zipper on the tent was busted. Ben swore under his breath as he tried to yank it closed. It would slide halfway up, then jam. We figured it wasn't the end of the world. If we angled the tent so the open part wasn't facing the wind, we'd be okay. Once the tent was as good as it was gonna get, we gathered some firewood and chowed down on some canned chili. That's when Ben started in on the local legends again. He leaned in closer to the fire and said he'd heard stories about a witch who haunted this part of the river. Supposedly, her singing would lure people into the woods, and they'd never come back. He made a big point of saying his grandpa used to warn him about the Blackfoot in particular. I just laughed, figuring he was trying to set the mood or maybe just mess with me a little. That night, we crawled into our sleeping bags early, planning to get up at dawn to fish. A chilly breeze was sneaking in through the broken zipper, but the day had been so calm and beautiful that I didn't think much of it. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I couldn't figure out why at first. Then I realized I was hearing something, a faint melody, like someone singing far away. I held my breath, trying to listen. It came and went with the wind, haunting but kind of soft. It made my skin crawl. I whispered Ben's name, but he was out cold. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just a dream or the wind playing tricks. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The next morning, sunlight was filtering through the tent, and I found Ben outside, crouched down near a smooth rock. He waved me over. There, etched into the stone, were these weird symbols. Circles with jagged lines cutting through them, and these tiny shapes that looked like runes. They looked fresh, like someone had carved them there recently. Ben's face was pale. "I've seen these before," he muttered, "in my grandpa's books. Maybe someone's just pulling a prank." I offered, trying to sound casual, but honestly, it was creepy. We decided to stick to the original plan, hoping some good fishing would take our minds off things. The river was gorgeous in the morning sun, and for a while, I actually managed to relax. That's when Ben's brand new fishing rod snapped in half right in the middle of a cast. A clean break, like someone had sliced it with a blade. He let out a string of curses, furious. I half expected him to blame it on witches or curses right then, but he just tossed the useless pole aside and asked to borrow one of mine. We fished for a few more hours, caught a couple of decent trout, and headed back to camp for lunch. By then, I was feeling a little better. The place was just too beautiful for me to dwell on weird carvings and broken gear. But Ben looked uneasy. He kept glancing at the tree line while we ate, and I asked him if he was okay. "I can't shake this feeling like we're being watched," he admitted, his voice low. "And last night I heard—" He trailed off, like he was worried I'd make fun of him for bringing up the singing again. I hesitated, not wanting him to think I was scared too. "Let's just keep our heads on straight, man," I said. "Maybe it's just wildlife or some local kids messing around." But that night, everything took a turn for the worse. So that night, things started to get really weird. We had a small fire going, talking in hushed voices. The wind picked up, making the flames dance around all crazy-like. Then, Ben suddenly froze, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond our campsite. He grabbed his flashlight and stood up. I saw someone," he whispered, pointing. I got up too, scanning the trees with my own flashlight. The beam just caught swaying branches and shadows. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe a deer or something," I said, but I could feel how tense he was, keeping his flashlight steady on the edge of the woods. We stood there like that for a few minutes, like statues, neither of us wanting to say how freaked out we really were. Finally, we sat back down. Ben insisted we keep the fire going all night, and I reluctantly agreed to stay up with him as long as I could. Around midnight, I guess I nodded off, lulled by sheer exhaustion. I woke up again to that same melody, that soft, mournful singing. But this time, it wasn't distant. It felt like it was drifting right through our campsite. The fire had died down to embers, and Ben's sleeping bag was empty. Panic shot through me. I scrambled out of the tent, calling his name. A pale moon cast long, eerie shadows across the riverbank. No answer. My flashlight cut through the night, revealing only the silhouettes of trees. "Ben," I yelled, feeling more scared than I wanted to admit. Then I heard that voice again, gentle, inviting, carried on a breeze. It seemed to be coming from somewhere downstream. I followed it, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I found fresh footprints on the soft earth, definitely Ben's boots. By the time I reached the river, the singing had gotten louder. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I moved carefully along the water's edge, my flashlight shaking in my sweaty grip. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the shoreline, his back to me, arms hanging limp at his sides. "Ben," I cried, relief flooding me for a split second. But he didn't move. I inched closer, shining the light on his face. His eyes were open but vacant, like he was in some kind of trance. I grabbed his shoulder. "What are you doing? We have to get back." He mumbled something, his voice raspy. "She's here. She's inside me." Then, without warning, he lurched forward and fell into the river. The current was strong, and the water surged around him. Terror ripped through me. I dropped my flashlight to grab him before he could be swept away. He struggled like a man possessed, but I managed to drag him back onto the rocky bank. He was half conscious, shivering, water streaming from his clothes. I heard her, he muttered. "Couldn't stop." I checked him for injuries, then helped him to his feet. "Let's get back to camp," I said, my voice shaking. I'd never been so terrified in my life. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Was he sleepwalking, hypnotized by that eerie melody, or was something else going on? When we got back to the tent, he collapsed, his teeth chattering. I wrapped him in blankets and stoked the fire back to life. Part of me wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there right then. But it was the middle of the night, and Ben was in no shape to travel. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching over him. At dawn, he was alert enough to talk, but clearly exhausted. He kept apologizing, saying he had no memory of walking to the river. He only remembered hearing that voice calling him. I told him it wasn't his fault, that we just needed to get out of there as soon as possible. We packed up quickly, but when we got to the Jeep, it was gone. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, just empty space where we'd parked it. Tire tracks cut through the dirt, leading away. We stared at the spot, stunned for what felt like an eternity. Had someone stolen our Jeep in the middle of nowhere? Ben's eyes filled with panic. "We're trapped," he whispered. I tried to keep it together. "We'll hike out," I said. "We'll find a main road and flag someone down." We had a little bit of food left, some water, and a couple of flashlights, one of which was barely working. Ben could hardly walk without stumbling, but we set off, determined to find help. The morning sun, which usually felt comforting, now felt harsh. Every rustle in the forest made us jump. I tried to shake the feeling that we were being watched, but it clung to me like a shadow. After an hour of trudging, Ben collapsed. He was out of breath, sweat pouring down his face. I gave him some water, urging him on. The forest felt endless. The more we walked, the more it seemed like the trail was looping back on itself. Then, in the distance, that singing started again. My stomach twisted into a knot. Ben clutched my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't listen," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. "We just have to keep going." But the melody grew louder, winding around the pines. It felt like it was inside my head. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I almost forgot why we were running. I bit my tongue, forcing myself to focus. Ben, however, started shaking uncontrollably. He mumbled incoherently, something about not being able to fight it. A wave of desperation washed over me. I half dragged, half carried Ben through the brush, ignoring the branches that tore at my arms. We eventually found a narrow dirt road, but it led to an old, rusted gate and an abandoned shack. The place reeked of decay. Inside the single, cramped room, we saw those same runic symbols scrawled on the walls. Dust and debris covered the floor. Ben sank against the wall, trembling. "I keep going," he said. "I'm sorry." Reluctantly, I decided we'd rest there. Daylight was fading, and the thought of stumbling through the woods at night again was unbearable. I propped the broken door shut with a chair, lit a small lantern I found in the shack, and tried to keep Ben warm. I couldn't sleep, not after everything that had happened. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to Ben muttering in some strange language, his eyes open but unseeing. I shook him until he snapped out of it. He stared at me, terrified, then closed his eyes again, as if surrendering to despair. Neither of us said much after that. When dawn finally broke, we left that creepy shack and kept going along the dirt road. Every step felt heavier than the last. It wasn't long before the singing started up again, chilling me to the bone. Ben dropped to his knees, covering his ears. In the distance, a dark figure stood between the trees. A woman in a ragged cloak, her face partially hidden. My flashlight beam caught a flash of something pale where her features should have been. She vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving only the echo of that melody. Somehow we made it back toward the river, though I'm pretty sure we took a different route. My heart sank when I recognized the same bend in the water, the same carved symbols on the nearby rocks. We were going in circles. I clutched Ben's hand, not wanting to lose him again. He slumped against a boulder, his eyes half closed. "I can't fight her," he whispered. "It's too strong." I was desperate for a solution, anything to break this cycle of terror. That's when I noticed something partially buried in the mud. Ben's old journal. The pages were waterlogged, but I could still make out some of the scribbled notes about a witch who could sing people to their doom. One passage read, "She never stops until she has what she wants. Burn her symbols. It's the only way." I glanced at Ben. "What does this mean?" His voice was faint. "My grandfather said, destroying the symbols might break her hold." It was a long shot, but I had nothing else. Gathering fallen branches, I built a small fire near the rock where the largest carvings were etched. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the matches. I tore out the journal pages, tossing them into the flames. Smoke curled upward, acrid and thick. As the symbols burned, the wind picked up, and I thought I heard a distant shriek, like the melody twisting in pain. Ben gasped, then started coughing. For a moment, it seemed like the tension in the air lifted, as though some invisible weight had been taken off our shoulders. I fanned the flames until the journal was nothing but ash. The singing faded. The forest felt strangely silent. Exhausted, we both collapsed, letting the fire die out on its own. The next thing I knew, the sun was high in the sky, and Ben was shaking me awake. His eyes looked clearer than they had in days. My limbs ached, but that oppressive dread was gone. There was just the quiet of the forest and the steady rush of the river. We stumbled onward, retracing our steps. This time, we found a path that led us to a dirt road wide enough for trucks. Late that afternoon, a pickup truck rumbled by. The driver, a burly guy named Hank, nearly skidded off the road when he saw our condition. Muddy, pale, and shaking, he took us into town without pressing for too many details, and honestly, we didn't offer many. The authorities took a statement about our stolen Jeep, but they didn't seem too hopeful about finding it. They chalked up the strange sightings and Ben's near drowning to some bizarre mishap, saying we were lucky to be alive. Ben and I haven't told anyone else the full story. I mean, who would believe us? Most people would just think we were crazy or had some kind of shared hallucination. I still hear the singing sometimes in my nightmares. Ben told me he hears it too, faint and mocking. We don't know if burning those symbols really banished whatever was out there, or if it just let us slip away for now. But we learned that some legends don't die. They just kind of fade into the background, waiting for someone to stumble into their territory. And the wild places in Montana, they hold secrets older than we care to imagine. My name is Alex Riley. I'm 27, and I survived the witch of the Blackfoot River, though a part of me is still lost in those woods. If you ever find yourself camping near that river, and you hear an eerie song on the wind, do yourself a favor, leave. Get out of there while you still can. Because once she sets her sights on you, it doesn't matter how rational or brave you think you are. Out there, where no one can hear you scream, some voices demand more than just your fear. They demand your soul. And sometimes the only way to escape is to play her game, to fight back with fire and hope that it's enough. But trust me, it's a gamble you don't want to take. Some doors are better left unopened, some songs better left unsung. The Blackfoot River holds its secrets close, and it's best to let them stay buried. Just take my word for it. You don't want to meet the witch. You really don't. My name is Ben Sterling, and I was 38 years old when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I dragged my family from the hustle of Seattle to some godforsaken plot of land near Flathead Lake, Montana. I had this stupid, stubborn idea that we could build a simpler, more honest life out there. Yeah, right. What happened next still haunts me, and I doubt we'll ever truly recover. I'd sunk my whole severance pay into what the ad called a fixer-upper homestead, the 50 acres of untamed wilderness. My wife, Sarah, she was 36 at the time. She went along with the dream, at least on the surface. But I could tell she had her doubts from the get-go. Our son, Alex, was 16, at that age where your parents are always wrong, no matter what. And our daughter, Chloe, only 12, was way more perceptive than I gave her credit for. The second we pulled up to that place, I knew we'd been had. The cabin looked like it was about to collapse. The walls were dark with rot, the roof was caved in, and the porch was sagging like an old man's back. The well, it spat out this nasty brown water, and the generator coughed like a chain smoker before dying completely. This was our first night. I tried to act like it was no big deal, but Sarah saw right through me. She always did. We hauled our stuff inside. The air was stale, smelled like damp wood and dust. Chloe sneezed twice, her face all scrunched up in disgust. Alex just grunted. "You said it'd be a paradise," he muttered. "Smells like something died in here." Sarah shot him a look, then touched my shoulder. "We'll make it work," she whispered. And we tried, we really did. We spent that first day cleaning, patching holes, and trying to get the ancient house generator working. No such luck. We had to use a camping one as backup. By sunset, We were lighting the place with candles and this one battery-powered lantern that kept flickering like something out of a horror movie. Alex was the first to bring up leaving. "It's gonna freeze tonight," he said, arms crossed. "We can't even get a fire going, 'cause the chimney's full of, bats." He was right. The chimney was rattling with sounds. Could have been bats. Could have been something worse. But I wasn't gonna let fear take over. "We'll fix it tomorrow," I declared, rubbing my aching arms. "We'll clear the chimney. Everything will be fine." That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every groan of that old cabin had me on edge. At one point, I swear I heard footsteps in the attic. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Or an animal. Nothing to worry about. But I could feel Sarah tense up beside me in the dark, and I knew she was just as freaked out as I was. Morning brought a whole new set of problems. The generator finally gave up the ghost, leaving us with just a tiny camping stove to heat water. The back door's lock was jammed. Alex complained he was starving, but when we checked our food stash in the kitchen, we found it ransacked. Something or someone had gotten into it. The packaging was torn, and it didn't look like an animal's work. It looked deliberate. While Sarah and I were arguing about how to secure our supplies, Chloe came up to us, her hair a mess, her face pale. "Mom, Dad," she said quietly, "there's a man outside." Alex and I rushed to the window. Sure enough, there was this guy standing by the fence, wearing a ratty jacket and muddy boots. He was staring at our cabin with this look on his face, pure resentment, I'd call it. We went outside, and he introduced himself as Ethan Hayes, 55, maybe older, with a permanent scowl etched on his face. All sun-beaten skin and hard lines. "You folks the Sterlings?" he asked in a gravelly voice. "Didn't figure anyone would move in here again." "That's us," I said, trying to sound friendly. "And you are?" "Nibber," he answered curtly. "Closest one you got, anyway." "About 2 miles east, through the woods." 2 miles hardly seemed neighborly, but out here I guess it was practically next door. Sarah came up behind me, forcing a smile. Ethan took off his hat, rubbed the back of his neck, and then said, in this low, ominous tone, "Don't stick around too long. This place ain't right. Wasn't right for the last folks, and it won't be for you." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked off, leaving us standing there in a cloud of unease. Chloe slipped her hand into mine. "I don't like him," she whispered. "Neither do I," Alex chimed in. "Would he say this place ain't right? What's that even supposed to mean?" I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow, even to me. "Probably just some superstitious old-timer," I said. "Old stories. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. Later that afternoon, I was unpacking tools in the barn, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps above me in the loft. I climbed up, found nothing but old hay and dust motes dancing in the sunlight, but the air felt charged somehow, like I was being watched. Things only got worse. At dusk, our brand new chainsaw jammed while we were trying to cut firewood, and the carburetor on the used ATV we'd bought decided to die. Alex, fuming, retreated inside. Sarah gave me a look that said she was about to lose it. Chloe just sat there, scribbling furiously in her sketchbook. By the time darkness settled, we were huddled around those candles again. The whole place felt eerie, alive, like the walls were leaning in, listening. Sarah was dozing on a makeshift couch when Chloe suddenly bolted upright from her sleeping bag with this blood-curdling scream that made my skin crawl. "What is it?" I shouted, rushing to her. "Something's grabbing me," she gasped, clawing at her ankles, tears streaming down her face. Sarah and I frantically checked, and sure enough, there were bruises forming on Chloe's skin, dark circular marks like fingerprints. Alex, hovering in the corner, looked like he was about to bolt. I tried to stay rational, tried to calm her down. "Maybe you hit them on something," I said, even though I couldn't explain how. "No," Chloe whimpered. "I felt hands pulling me." We stayed up the rest of that night, huddled around the lantern, too shaken to sleep. Alex dozed off once, then jerked awake at every little sound. Sarah rubbed Chloe's ankle, while I fought off this growing dread that something truly sinister was going on here. In the early morning, I went outside to get more water from the well, and I nearly stumbled backward in shock. Hanging from the porch beam was this thing, a twisted little effigy made of bones and twigs, all tied together with something rotten. Rawhide, maybe, or sinew. The stench was enough to make me gag. I yanked it down and hurled it as far as I could into the woods. My hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. I couldn't face the idea that Ethan's warning might be real, or that we might not be alone on this property. I should have told them, though, because that afternoon, Chloe came in from the yard holding that same damned effigy in her hands, or one just like it. "Dad," she said, her voice shaky. "This was hanging from the tree outside my window." Sarah paled at the sight of it, and Alex actually cursed under his breath. That's when I finally broke and told them I'd found it earlier and thrown it away. "Someone's doing this," I insisted. "Some sick prank. Could be Ethan, or some other local, trying to scare us off." Alex spat. "So you think someone broke in last night," bruised Chloe, "and then left this thing? That's insane." "Better than ghosts," I snapped, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. That evening, we double-checked the locks and propped a chair under the doorknob. I kept an old hunting rifle by my side, a relic from my dad's days. Sarah was so tense she didn't say a word after sundown. Alex paced the living room like a caged animal. Chloe just sat at the table, drawing. Her pencil moved in these quick, sharp lines that made me uneasy. A knock on the door nearly made me jump out of my skin. I peered through the window, rifle clutched tight, only to see Ethan outside. His face was like stone in the flickering porch light. I invited him in, out of caution or desperation. I'm still not sure. He stood near the entrance, his eyes darting around our candlelit living room. "Heard you've been having trouble," he said, his voice low. "And how exactly did you hear that?" I asked, unable to keep the accusation out of my tone. He shrugged. "Ward gets around. Strange howls. Lights in the night. You might hear folks say it's haunted. Or cursed." Alex let out a derisive laugh, and Sarah tried to hush him. I bristled. "You're not doing much to help us. If you know something, just say it." Ethan pressed his lips together, studying me. "Last owners," he said slowly, "disappeared. Plain and simple. Husband, wife, 2 kids, gone without a trace. People searched for weeks. Found nothing. Not a single body. Chloe's face went white. Sarah's hand shook on the back of a chair. "Why didn't you tell us that before?" she demanded. "You wouldn't have believed me," Ethan muttered, pulling his hat down lower. "And to be honest, I hoped it wouldn't happen again." He left without another word, disappearing into the blackness outside. No one slept that night. We took turns keeping watch. Sometime in the early hours, I found Alex at the kitchen window, staring out at the tree lane. He looked furious. "You should have listened to him," he said, his voice tight. "We should have never come here." I rubbed my eyes, bone tired. "Tomorrow," I said, "we'll figure something out. We'll get in the car and just drive to a motel if we have to." But come morning, the car wouldn't start. The battery was completely drained, and when I popped the hood, I saw that the wiring had been chewed through or cut. It didn't look accidental. Alex, in a rage, kicked the tire and stormed off into the woods. I shouted for him to come back, but he ignored me. We had no landline, and the nearest cell signal was a shaky bar or two, if you stood on the right hill. Sarah glared at me like this was all my fault. Maybe it was. An hour passed, then two, and Alex didn't return. Anxiety gnawed at my stomach. I grabbed my jacket, told Sarah to stay with Chloe, and marched into the woods to find him. The air was still, every branch and leaf coated with a hush that made the hair on my neck stand up. I followed Alex's footprints as far as I could, until they seemed to just vanish near the old well, a decrepit stone circle, half covered with moss. My heart hammered. Alex's flashlight lay on the ground, and a piece of his jacket was snagged on a splintered board. I shouted his name until my throat burned, but no response came. In the silence, I thought I heard a muffled cry, echoing from deep within the woods. Or maybe it was just the wind. Terror seized me. I ran back to the cabin, panting, only to find Chloe sitting on the porch steps, staring at that same bone and twig effigy. It was now mounted on a low, hanging branch. She had this distant, vacant look in her eyes, pencil clenched in her hand. Sarah rushed out, frantic. "Where's Alex?" "He's gone," I said numbly. I don't know where." Chloe stood up, her voice monotone, her eyes glassy. "He belongs to the woods now," she said. The words sent a chill down my spine. "Kilo?" I stammered. "What are you talking about?" She blinked, as if waking from a dream, looked down at the drawing in her hand, and shrieked, tossing the paper aside. I caught a glimpse of it, twisted trees, a figure hanging by its arms, and strange symbols in the background. The same symbols we'd seen carved into the trees earlier. Night fell too quickly. We scavenged all the flashlights we had, made torches from rags soaked in kerosene. Sarah insisted we search for Alex, and I agreed, though the fear in my gut told me it might be too late, too dangerous. Chloe clutched Sarah's hand, silent and trembling. We were just stepping off the porch when Ethan appeared, panting, a shotgun in his hands. "Stop," he called out. "You'll never find him in the dark." Sarah turned on him, fury in her eyes. "My son is missing. Are you telling me to just sit here?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I've been out there. Tried to find him. Couldn't. Place is twisting around, like it don't want you to leave. Not now." I couldn't suppress a trembling rage. "Don't want me to leave? This is my property." He locked eyes with me, sorrow etched on his face. It was their property too, the ones that disappeared. Enough with the warnings. I roared, but deep down, I knew he was right. The land had a hold on us, and we were running out of time. Sarah demanded, "What's happening? What do we do?" "Sometimes," Ethan said carefully, "you got to find the source and destroy it. My guess, whatever's under this house or on this land." I heard rumors of a cellar, something the old owners never talked about. I remembered the barn, a trapdoor I'd assumed was just for animal feed storage. Without another word, I grabbed a lantern and we raced there together. The trap door was stuck, rotted boards blocking the way. Ethan used the butt of his shotgun to pry it open, and a stench of earth and decay hit us in a rush. We descended, the steps shaky beneath our feet. The lantern illuminated a cramped space, carved into the ground. The walls were lined with those same symbols Chloe had drawn. Sarah gagged at the sight of mounds of bones, animals and humans, stacked in a corner, some with rotting scraps of cloth still clinging to them. My heart pounded so loud I could barely think. At the center of the cellar lay a flat slab of stone, covered with bloodstains, old or new, I couldn't tell. Something cold seemed to swirl in the air, passing through us like a malevolent wind. Chloe clutched my arm, her eyes wide, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "It's here," she whispered. A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the space, making my ears pop. The lantern flickered, then dimmed. In the corner of the cellar, a shadow took shape. It had no defined features, but I felt its intent, felt it probing our minds. Ethan aimed his shotgun, but before he could fire, the form darted across the cellar and vanished, leaving a whispered hiss in its wake. Ethan's voice shook. "I've seen something like that before. Years ago. Took my wife, my daughter." My chest tightened. "And it's taken Alex." The realization made me want to lash out, to destroy everything down here. Sarah, sobbing, stepped toward the slab. "We have to do something." In that moment, Chloe's grip on my arm turned iron strong. She jerked her head back, her eyes rolling white, her mouth open, but the voice that emerged was low, guttural. "You do not belong. You will not leave. Ah, Silo, stop it." I shook her. She convulsed once, then collapsed in my arms. I laid her down, my hand trembling over her forehead. She was cold as ice. Ethan rummaged around, found that disgusting effigy, the same one we'd seen before, this time set on a small altar. "This might be a tether," he growled, raising the shotgun. "Wheat," Sarah said. "That's the same thing we keep seeing. Destroy it." But Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired. The noise was deafening. The effigy splintered apart in a spray of bone and dirt. I grabbed a half-buried can of kerosene from the corner, doused the remains, and set them aflame with a match. The flames spat and hissed, turning the entire cellar into a dancing frenzy of light and shadow. Something shrieked, not from Chloe, not from Ethan, not from any human lung. It filled the air in a wave of dread, nearly knocking me over. Chloe's body jerked violently, then she slumped back with a soft moan. "Ben," Sarah cried. "We can't stay here." I scooped Chloe into my arms, and the four of us scrambled up the steps, suffocated by the swirling smoke that trailed behind us. Ethan slammed the trapdoor shut, and we stumbled out into the barn. The night sky stretched overhead, cold and uncaring. We heard one last echo of that shriek, deep underground, then it faded. We rushed back to the cabin to grab whatever we could, but honestly, there wasn't much worth saving. Everything felt trivial compared to getting Chloe and Sarah to safety. Ethan didn't linger. He set off for his truck, which was parked out on some rough path. He offered to help us get out, and there was no question we were leaving. Now, even if I had to walk all the way to the highway. Chloe stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "Dad," she mumbled. "I'm here," I whispered, tears burning the corners of my eyes. "We're leaving. It's over." But I spoke too soon. A thunderous crash echoed from behind the cabin, and a violent gust of wind nearly knocked us off our feet. The door to the barn slammed shut on its own, as if an invisible hand had grabbed it. Sarah grabbed my shirt, terror in her eyes. "What was that?" "I don't know," I gasped. "But run." We ran, half carrying, half pulling Chloe across the yard. Then we froze, our hearts pounding in a shared horror. Standing against the tree line was a shape tall and indistinct, yet undeniably real. My eyes were drawn to the silhouette next to it, another shape, smaller, more familiar. "Alex!" Sarah screamed, trying to rush forward. I tightened my grip on her arm. "No," I hissed. I don't think it's him anymore." But she broke free from my hold and bolted across the yard. For a second, I thought I saw recognition in that smaller figure's stance, a brief twitch of the head. Then the tall shadow reached out and absorbed the smaller shape, pulling it back into the darkness. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing wildly. I'll never forget that moment, my wife, broken and hopeless, the supernatural horror toying with us from just a few yards away. Chloe tugged weakly at my sleeve, pointing wordlessly toward the driveway, the direction Ethan had gone. We had to leave, or we'd all be lost. I pulled Sarah to her feet, half dragging her until her survival instincts kicked in again. The three of us staggered down the gravel path, clinging to each other in the moonlight. We found Ethan's truck at the bend, the engine rumbling. He was waving frantically for us to hurry. "Where's Alex?" he demanded as we piled in. Sarah let out a heart-wrenching sob, and I shook my head. I couldn't form the words. With a pained grimace, Ethan slammed on the gas, and we tore away from that cursed homestead. We left everything, clothes, furniture, even the shattered pieces of that stupid dream. The headlights cut through the dense forest road, occasionally revealing fleeting shapes at the edges of our vision. Twisted trees, or something else entirely. Once or twice, I thought I saw a figure running parallel to the truck, a pale blur in the shadows, but I didn't dare say it out loud. When we finally reached the main highway, the tension in my chest exploded and I wept. We found a motel hours away, where Sarah and Chloe collapsed into a haunted sleep. I sat outside the door, rifle on my lap, expecting that thing to appear any moment. But it never did. The next day, I tried calling the local authorities, but no one believed our story. They formed a search party for Alex, but they found nothing except that torn jacket near the well. They asked me 100 questions I couldn't answer. Eventually, they wrote him off as a runaway or lost in the wilderness. I knew better. We sold the homestead remotely at a severe loss. No one would give us a fair price once they heard the rumors. Word gets around, even in places as remote as Flathead Lake. Weeks later, while loading up the few items we'd salvaged, I found a small, charred piece of bone in one of our moving boxes, a remnant of that blasted effigy, perhaps. I felt a sudden chill, imagining that the evil from that place had followed us. I hurled it into a dumpster, half expecting it to reappear somewhere else. Thankfully, it never did. Our daughter, Chloe, never truly went back to being the carefree girl she once was. She's quiet now, stares off into space a lot. Sometimes, I catch her talking to herself in a hushed voice. Sarah's tried everything: counseling, medication, you name it, to help Chloe deal with the trauma. But late at night, I hear her calling out for Alex in her sleep, tears soaking her pillow. It's a sound that cuts me to the core. I haven't spoken to Ethan since that night. Sometimes, I think I see him in my nightmares, standing by that truck, muttering, "Thee never leave for good." I suspect he still lives out there alone, resigned to the horror that lurks in those woods. Maybe he's become a part of it, in a way. As for me, I'm consumed by guilt and regret. I tried to find something better for my family, and instead, I handed them over to a nightmare. My only hope is that one day, somehow, Alex will return. But deep down, I know the truth. The land took him, just like it took so many before. And it isn't finished, not really. It never will be. That's my story, our story. I doubt anyone will believe it, just as I doubted the stories Ethan told me. But if you ever come across an unbelievable real estate deal near Flathead Lake, if you ever think you can tame some forgotten patch of cursed ground, remember what happened to me, Ben Sterling, 38 years old at the time, and my family. Some places are better left alone, no matter how enticing the dream of a fresh start might be. The peace you think you're buying might just cost you everything. And the silence you hear in those woods, it's not the sound of tranquility. It's the sound of something ancient, something hungry, waiting for you to make a mistake. A single mistake to let your guard down. It waits, it watches, and it never forgets. The scars from that place, they're not just on Chloe or on Sarah. They're on me too. They're etched into my soul. And every time I close my eyes, I see that cabin, that cellar, that shadowy figure in the woods. Every time I hear the wind whisper through the trees, I hear that shriek. Every time I see my daughter's haunted eyes, I remember the price we paid for a dream that turned into a living nightmare. So, take my advice. Heed the warnings that others dismiss. Some places are not meant to be tamed. Some places are not meant to be healed. Some places are just meant to be left alone, forever, because the cost of ignoring that truth, it's a price no one should ever have to pay. I hope this concludes the story in a way that is both chilling and satisfying. Let me know if you have any other questions. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm 28, and what I'm about to tell you went down last summer in the crazy mountains of Montana. I've been going back and forth about sharing this because honestly, it was terrifying. I still get nightmares. I don't know if I'll ever really shake off what happened out there. So, I went on this trip, this seriously messed up trip, with my best friend, Jake Miller, his girlfriend Emily Hayes, and our buddy Chris Davis. We'd been planning this whole thing to hit up this isolated lake in the crazies that Jake found online. The pictures were insane, crystal clear water, these jagged peaks all around, and barely any trails going in or out. We were all, yeah, this is gonna be awesome, thinking it would be this chill escape from our hectic city lives. A chance to get back to nature, challenge ourselves a bit. Man, were we wrong. From the second we got to the trailhead, the whole vibe was just off. It started with the gear Jake had bought. See, he'd gotten most of it secondhand to save a few bucks: tents, water filters, a little camp stove. At first, I gave him crap for being such a cheapskate, but he swore up and down everything was fine. We were about to find out his confidence was a little misplaced, to say the least. We started hiking in the early afternoon, after this long, bumpy drive up a dirt road. The sun was blazing, and the forest around us was super thick and quiet. I remember looking at Jake's GPS when we first set off, noticing the battery was already at like 50%. He just shrugged, saying he had a backup battery pack. Emily, who's usually the quiet one, asked for help adjusting her backpack straps. This was her first real hiking trip, and you could tell she was out of her element. Chris, on the other hand, kept cracking jokes about bears and mountain lions lurking in the shadows. That was just his way of dealing with nerves, I think. A couple of hours in, Emily was already struggling. She slipped on some loose rocks twice, nearly twisting her ankle. Chris offered to carry some of her stuff, and she thanked him. But he couldn't help throwing in a snarky comment about her being a rookie. It stung, and I could see the tension starting to build between them. Jake, trying to lighten the mood, promised that once we got to the lake, we'd forget all about our aching muscles. We finally set up our first campsite in this little clearing beside a creek. The crazy mountains were looming above us, their peaks catching the last bit of sunlight. The forest felt weirdly still, though. No birds, no rustling, just the faint trickle of water over rocks. Something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After dinner, as it got dark, we all huddled by the fire. Jake played some music from his phone, which honestly felt out of place, like we were intruding on the silence of that wild place. I excused myself to step away for a minute, heading into the trees to wash a few dishes in the creek. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It could have been the wind, but it felt too deliberate. I stopped, turned around, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. My heart was pounding. When I got back to the fire, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it had to be the wind. But that feeling that something wasn't right, it stuck with me. The next day was even worse. We found out Jake's GPS had totally crapped out. The screen was just glitching, and we couldn't rely on it at all. Jake dug around for his spare battery pack, only to find that it was busted. The plastic was cracked, or something must have happened during the hike. I had my phone, but there was zero service that deep in the mountains, and we'd been counting on the GPS for the unmarked trails. We actually argued about turning back, but Chris was all, "We've come this far, we're not quitting now." Emily looked torn. but she ultimately went along with Jake, and so we kept going. Before lunch, Emily tripped again, and this time she really did sprain her ankle. She insisted she was okay, but I could tell by the way she was clenching her jaw and the tears she was trying to blink back that she was in serious pain. We took a break so she could wrap it with a bandage. Meanwhile, Jake and Chris were trying to fix our water filter, which had cracked at the base. Without it, we'd have to boil all our water over a campfire or risk drinking straight from the creek. Not ideal. Jake started blaming himself for buying used gear. I tried to reassure him, but you could feel the frustration in the group. It was thick, like the humid air. That night, we made camp in a new spot, deeper in the forest. The silence was back, weighing on us. Our campfire felt like this tiny little island of warmth in a sea of darkness. We were all too tired to even talk much. I was leaning against a log, letting the crackle of the flames soothe my frayed nerves, when a voice called out from the darkness. Sarah. It was my voice, or at least it sounded like me, echoing from the trees beyond our firelight. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Next to me, Jake and Chris looked just as freaked out. Emily stared into the darkness, her eyes wide. Sarah. The voice called again, but there was this weird distortion to it, like an echo on a busted speaker. Chris jumped to his feet, aiming his flashlight into the trees. Nothing. The voice stopped as suddenly as it started. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying it was the wind or some trick of the night, but I saw the fear in his eyes. None of us slept well after that. Not even a wink. In the morning, we found these huge claw-like scratches on a tree near our tents. Fresh scratches that cut deep into the bark. I ran my fingers over them, trying to figure out what kind of animal could have done that. A bear, maybe, but the pattern looked all wrong, too narrow, too deliberate. Jake suggested a mountain lion, but I could see he didn't really believe it. We decided to pack up fast and move on, hoping to find an easier way out of the forest and back to the trailhead. Emily was being really quiet. Her face was pale, and every time the wind rustled the leaves, she'd flinch. As we hiked, her behavior got even weirder. She stopped talking altogether, sometimes lagging behind and staring off into the woods. We'd have to call her name several times before she'd snap out of it. Chris teased her about it at first, but even he eventually shut up when he saw the vacant look in her eyes. It was seriously creeping us all out. That night, we set up camp one last time, deciding we'd wake up super early to head back to the car, even if it meant retracing our steps. The plan was to give Emily's ankle a bit of a rest, and then make a straight shot for the trailhead. The mood in camp was grim. We gathered around the fire again, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The wind picked up, rattling the branches above us. It was close to midnight when I woke up to the sound of hushed voices. I looked around the dark tent, realizing Jake was still asleep beside me. Emily was in another tent, presumably with Chris, but the voices were coming from outside. I crawled out, the cold air hitting my face. In the glow of my flashlight, I could see footprints leading away from our campsite. They belonged to Chris, judging by the size. I heard him speaking to someone, only I couldn't make out another voice responding. I started walking toward the sound, calling his name quietly. "Chris, are you okay?" No answer. The footprints veered behind a large boulder. When I got there, I found only Chris's jacket on the ground, his flashlight still switched on, shining into the darkness. No sign of Chris himself. I felt a stab of panic. I ran back to camp, shaking Jake awake. He shot up, instantly frantic once I told him Chris was missing. We scrambled to find him, our calls echoing through the silent woods. We searched for hours, but we never found more than those footprints, which, and this is where it gets really messed up, gradually started to change shape in the soft earth. They started out human, the clear tread of Chris's hiking boots. Then they became elongated, as though he'd been stepping differently. Past that point, the ground looked like it had been raked with claws, the prints dragging through the dirt in a half-moon shape. It made zero sense. Emily was getting agitated, pacing near the dying embers of our campfire. She started muttering to herself. When Jake asked her what she was saying, she just looked at him, her eyes dark and hollow. She kept repeating, "They won't let us leave. They won't let us leave," in this voice that sent a chill straight through my bones. I tried to calm her down, but she shrugged me off. In the confusion and panic of Chris's disappearance, we decided we couldn't wait any longer. We had to get out of the mountains and contact search and rescue. We had no working GPS, but we figured we could backtrack. Emily resisted at first, insisting we had to listen to them. But Jake and I managed to pull her along. That day was a total nightmare. We stumbled through thick undergrowth, trying to retrace our steps, and realizing we might be going in circles. The forest around us felt hostile. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow seemed to take on a menacing shape. Emily was almost unrecognizable. Sometimes she'd just stop dead in her tracks and stare off into space. She seemed physically drained. But there was something else, too, like she was caught in some kind of trance she couldn't break. As afternoon turned to dusk, we found ourselves by a small clearing. The ground was littered with stones and sticks arranged in these bizarre patterns of spirals, triangles, and shapes I couldn't even name. Emily walked right into the center of it, falling to her knees. Jake shouted for her, but she didn't respond. She just knelt there, swaying back and forth, whispering words I couldn't understand. It sounded like chanting, but in a language none of us recognized. A sudden wind tore through the clearing, scattering some of the stones and branches. Emily stood up, her eyes rolling back in her head. She spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, a deep, low growl that sent panic coursing through my veins. Jake lunged for her, but she shoved him away with a strength that didn't seem possible, given her small frame. He flew backward, landing hard on his shoulder. I rushed to his side, helping him up. He was trembling, and I could see the raw terror in his eyes. Emily advanced on us, still mumbling those guttural sounds. Her face was contorted, almost predatory. I tried to reason with her, calling her name over and over. Then, just as suddenly as it began, she collapsed to the ground, racked by convulsions. We didn't know what to do. I shouted for Jake to help me carry her, but he hesitated. Fear etched into every line of his face. Finally, he helped me lift her and move away from the clearing. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering. Her skin felt icy to the touch. We didn't get far before night fell completely. We set up our tent in a hurry, trying to keep Emily warm. She was shivering uncontrollably. Jake and I sat beside her, wrapped in sleeping bags and blankets, but she just stared past us, muttering incoherently. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off, because I woke to Jake shaking me. "Sarah, she's not breathing right," he said, his voice quivering. I knelt by Emily, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was there but faint, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. She looked at me then, and for the first time in hours, I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze. Her lips moved. I leaned close, and she whispered something that sounded like, "Run." Then her eyes rolled back, and her body went limp. I felt for a pulse again, but there was nothing. She was gone. We tried CPR, but it was hopeless. I don't remember how long we stayed there, sobbing and shaking. I only recall the sense of utter despair. Chris was missing, and now Emily was dead. Something in these mountains was picking us off one by one. We had no choice but to leave her. Even now, that decision haunts me. Carrying her body back to civilization would have been impossible in our condition. We couldn't even carry ourselves very confidently. We wrapped her in a sleeping bag, tears streaming down our faces, and said a final goodbye. That was the most agonizing thing I've ever done. Then we ran. It was more stumbling than running, our minds clouded with fear. The darkness was absolute, and the trees seemed to close in on us. At some point, we found a faint trail that led to a river, and we followed it as best we could. We didn't dare look back. Every so often, I heard something behind us, branches snapping, the rustle of undergrowth, but whenever we turned, all we saw was darkness. By what felt like sheer luck or some last shred of mercy, we finally reached the trailhead at sunrise. Our car was still there, scratched and smeared with mud, as though something had tried to get inside. We threw ourselves into it, not daring to check the engine or even gather our breath. Jake turned the key, and by some miracle, the car started. We drove as fast as we could down that narrow dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, some shadow or twisted shape, chasing after us. But we were alone. By the time we reached a nearby town, we were filthy, bleeding from small cuts, and half crazed with terror. We stumbled into the local sheriff's station to report what had happened. A search party went out, but nothing conclusive was found. No sign of Chris, and no trace of Emily's body. They questioned us for hours, and we told them everything. I doubt they believed our story. They probably chalked it up to an animal attack combined with our inexperience. Officially, Chris and Emily are still listed as missing. Jake and I stopped speaking soon after. We drifted apart, consumed by guilt and fear, and the unspoken horror of what we saw out there. I try to reach out to him sometimes, but the phone calls are short, polite. We never discuss the crazy mountains or what happened to our friends. Months passed, and I returned to my apartment, going through the motions of daily life. But at night, the nightmares come. I see Chris lost in the dark, calling to me in my own voice. I see Emily chanting in that clearing, stones and sticks forming patterns around her. I see claw marks etched into the trunk of a tree. And I always wake in a cold sweat, convinced something is watching me from the corner of my room. A few weeks ago, I woke up around 300 in the morning, hearing the wind howl outside my window. As I tried to calm my racing heart, I heard a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. Sarah. The voice was my own, soft, echoing and impossibly close. I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't dare get out of bed to look outside. It wasn't the wind. It was the same horrifying mimicry that stalked us in the mountains. I haven't heard it again since, but I live every day bracing for the moment it returns. I've considered moving, changing my name, starting fresh somewhere far away. But deep down, I suspect it wouldn't matter. Whatever we woke in the crazy mountains, whatever took Chris and Emily, it wants me to remember. It wants me to know that no matter how far I run, I'll never truly escape. I tell this story now as a warning. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Some forces, call them skinwalkers, call them evil spirits, call them whatever you want, thrive in the darkness, in the hidden corners of the world where few dare to go. I learned the hard way that our curiosity and bravado can lead us into horrors we're not prepared to face. If you ever find yourself in the crazy mountains, heed the silence. Turn back before nightfall, and if you hear a voice in the darkness calling your name, especially if it sounds like your own, run, just run. My name is Sarah Peterson. I'm 38, and this all went down at Willow Creek, Montana. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. We should have known better. We really should have picked a safer spot. I still have nightmares about what was waiting for us out there. So, picture this. It's me, my husband, Ben, our 2 kids, my brother-in-law, all crammed into our beat-up old RV. Ben is 40, your typical stubborn, I know what I'm doing kind of guy. We've got Lily, our 8-year-old, a total sweetheart who loves anything to do with nature. And then there's Connor, our 14-year-old, who's basically glued to his phone, complete with the standard teenage eye roll. Last but not least is my brother-in-law, Dave. He is 45 and is really into conspiracy theories and legends and stuff. Anyway, we were all, let's get away from it all, reconnect with nature. You know, the whole 9 yards. Escape the chaos of modern life. Yeah, right? We rolled into Willow Creek on this bright, sunny afternoon. The sky was that perfect. Postcard blue, and the lake was all sparkly and inviting. But even then, I got this weird feeling, like a little shiver down my spine. It felt like the air was thicker, heavier, closer to the water. Ben, of course, brushed it off. "You're just being paranoid," he said. He was all about showing the kids a good time, proving he was still the fun dad. Whatever. Lily was bouncing off the walls, excited to explore. Connor, naturally, had his earbuds in, ready to tune out the moment things got too family-ish. He had been a real pain lately, always arguing with his dad. Dave, being Dave, was already rambling about some local legends he'd read online. We finally got the RV parked near the edge of the lake, in this tight little clearing surrounded by these huge pine trees. And of course, the first sign of trouble, the generator starts sputtering. Ben, Mr. Fix It, fiddled with it until it roared back to life, but I just knew it was a temporary fix. We were barely setting up the camp chairs when Dave whipped out his phone, snapping pictures of the lake like a tourist. Then he called me over, all excited, pointing at these weird symbols carved into a tree near our site. They were all swirly, kind of like ancient runes, maybe Native American, or I don't know what. Creeped me out, to be honest. But Dave, he was loving it. The sun went down way faster than we expected. It was like the light just drained out of the sky. We managed to get a little campfire going, roasted some marshmallows. Lily almost set hers on fire, naturally, and Connor just poked at the coals, bored out of his mind. Dave, meanwhile, was in his element, telling us all these spooky stories about a water witch that supposedly haunted Willow Creek, luring people into the water. He thought it was hilarious. I just felt this knot in my stomach tighten. And the wind, when it blew across the lake, it was seriously cold, like unnaturally cold. We all piled into the RV for the night, but I couldn't sleep. Every little creak, every rustle of leaves outside, had me on edge. I just couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. Then, around midnight, I heard it, this faint whispering sound, coming from outside. It was like it was circling the RV. I sat up, and I saw Ben was awake too, his brow all furrowed. He mumbled something about it just being the wind, but he didn't sound too convinced. And then, bam, the generator died. Just sputtered out, leaving us in complete darkness, except for the moonlight coming through the windows. For a split second, I swear I saw something standing near the water's edge, a dark, hunched shape, but then I blinked and it was gone, so. Morning comes and Ben's out there, trying to get the generator going again. He's muttering and cursing under his breath, all macho and refusing help. Dave, in the meantime, is practically skipping around, pointing out these fresh claw marks on the trees near our campsite. Probably just a beer, I said, trying to convince myself, but even I didn't fully buy it. Lily, who's usually our little ray of sunshine, was quiet, like really quiet. She ate her breakfast without a word, her eyes darting to the lake every few seconds. When I asked her what was wrong, she whispered that she had a bad dream about a mean old lady calling her name. My blood ran cold. I tried to tell her it was just a dream, but honestly, I was starting to freak out a little myself. Dave, of course, was in his element. He went off exploring further around the shoreline and came back with more pictures of those creepy symbols. Said he was going to research them later, figure out what they meant. I really didn't like the idea of him wandering around alone, but Ben was like, "Relax, he can handle himself. It's just old, spooky stuff. Nothing to worry about." Famous last words, right? Then after lunch, Connor starts going off about how there's no cell service. He's practically having a meltdown because he can't check his messages. Ben tells him to man up, which, of course, goes over like a lead balloon. They start going at it, yelling and screaming. They'd been like this for months, and being cooped up here with no escape was just making it worse. Finally, Connor throws his baseball cap on the ground and storms off to sit by the lake, glaring at the water like it personally insulted him. Teenagers, am I right? Later that afternoon, Dave comes back, practically vibrating with excitement. He'd found this weird wooden totem thing, all covered in carvings, and he's taking a million pictures of it. Then he starts going on about these footprints he saw leading down to the lake, footprints that just vanished into the water. He was so jazzed about it, but I just felt this dread, like he was messing with something he shouldn't be. Lily tugged on my arm, whispering that she felt cold, even though the sun was shining. That night, after dinner, I tried to lighten the mood. I found some silly, scary stories online, old downloads on my phone, and read them to the kids. But even that felt forced, like we were all just going through the motions. The wind was picking up, rattling the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us just beyond the glow of our lantern. We retreated to the RV, but that sense of unease was like a thick blanket, suffocating us. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a jolt. I heard this muffled cry, and instantly I knew it was Lily. I grabbed a flashlight and bolted out of the RV. I found her standing ankle deep in the lake, her arms just hanging at her sides, staring out at the dark water. My flashlight beam caught something in the water behind her, a reflection, like a hunched figure with long, stringy white hair. But when I spun around, there was nothing there. I grabbed Lily, soaking my pajamas up to my knees, and pulled her back. She came to, like she'd been in a trance, and started sobbing, saying the lady wanted her to go deeper. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it was going to explode. Ben reached us a second later, panting and furious with himself for not waking up sooner. We wrapped Lily in a blanket and huddled inside. She said the lady had long, pale arms and a voice like gurgling water. Ben tried to comfort her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Dave, on the other hand, was alarmingly excited. "We have to investigate this," he said, his eyes shining with that reckless curiosity that had been making me nervous from the start. "We'll keep her safe, but there's definitely something here. I swear the guy had a death wish." And that's when we realized we were trapped. The RV wouldn't start. The engine would grind, but it wouldn't catch. We were officially stuck in the middle of nowhere, with a creepy lake, a potential water witch, and no way out. Things were going from bad to worse real fast. So, the RV is officially dead. Ben's going crazy trying to figure out what's wrong, but nothing's working. We had enough food and water for a few more days, but all I wanted was to get the hell out of there. No cell service, a busted generator, and a lake that seemed to be possessed were more than enough reasons to leave. But Ben and Dave kept saying, we should just fix the RV. See if we could maybe patch things up. I was close to losing it. What if we couldn't leave? What if we were stuck here for good? Ethan was being weirdly quiet. He just stood by the open RV door, staring out at the lake. No scowling, no yelling, just unnerved. Like he couldn't wrap his head around what he'd seen the night before. Lily wouldn't let go of me, refusing to leave my side unless Ben was holding her. She kept staring at the water, tears welling up in her eyes at every little sound. Around midday, Dave got antsy. He grabbed his flashlight, camera, and a small backpack. "Just gonna check those carvings again," he insisted. "I'll be back before dark." I wanted to scream, tell him not to go. But what was the point? Ben didn't even try to stop him. He just kept messing with the RV engine like his life depended on it. I was torn, wanting to stay with my kids but also feeling like I needed to chase after Dave, keep him from doing something stupid. Evening came and guess what? No Dave. The sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky this creepy orange color. Ben's attempts to fix the RV were going nowhere. Every time the engine sputtered, Lily flinched. Connor was pacing back and forth, biting his nails, something I'd never seen him do before. I was consumed with this feeling of dread, picturing Dave stumbling into something he couldn't handle. Around midnight, I thought I heard Dave's voice, calling my name. I rushed outside, with Ben right behind me. The moon was reflecting off the water, making the whole scene look silver and surreal. My heart was pounding. "Dave," I shouted, shining my flashlight around. No answer. But then we saw them footprints leading down to the lake. Adult footprints, still damp. They vanished right where the water began. And floating there, in the shallows, was Dave's flashlight flickering weakly. We both waded in, the icy water shocking my legs. I refused to go deeper than my knees. Ben grabbed the flashlight, shining it around desperately. Nothing. The footprints in the muddy bank were definitely Dave's boots, but he was gone. We yelled his name until our voices were hoarse, but no one answered. That was the first time I saw real, pure terror in Ben's eyes. When we got back to the campsite, the generator popped and died again, for good this time, leaving us in complete darkness. We huddled together inside the RV, not sleeping, just existing. No one knew what to do. Lily was wrapped in blankets, trembling. Connor sat stiffly, his eyes darting towards the windows. Ben just pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, like he was trying to magically will the engine to start. At some point, I noticed Lily's lips moving, but she wasn't making any sound. I brushed the hair out of her eyes and asked her what she was doing. She turned to me and her eyes were just vacant. Then she muttered a few words, in this language I didn't understand. Her voice was low and raspy, totally unlike her. My heart hammered in my chest. "Lily, honey, talk to me," I said, my voice shaking. She snapped out of it suddenly and started sobbing. I held her close, terrified. The cold in the RV was getting worse, seeping through the thin walls. Ben set his jaw. "I have to try the engine again," he said. He swore that if we could just get it to catch, we'd leave Dave to the authorities, find someone who could search for him properly. The guilt and desperation in his voice were agonizing. He tried until the battery was practically drained, but the engine wouldn't cooperate. Sometime before dawn, Lily started whispering that the lady was outside. Connor, half asleep, opened the curtains a crack. He gasped, and I forced myself to look. There, standing by the pines, was a silhouette, leaning forward at this unnatural angle. Its skin was almost glowing in the moonlight, pale and sickly. Long, white hair covered its face, and its arms dangled like they were disconnected from its body. Then, it lifted its arm, pointing directly at our RV. Ben grabbed the door handle, ready to charge out there, but I gripped his arm, hissing, "No, don't." The figure vanished like a mirage, leaving only a cold wind rattling the door. That night felt like it lasted a lifetime. When the sun finally rose, I was beyond exhausted. We were running on fumes, both physically and emotionally. Lily was barely speaking, and even when she did, she sounded distant, like she was slipping away. Ben noticed these scratch marks all over the sides of the RV and around the door, like claws had raked across the metal. And there was this smell, faint but definitely there, like rotting plants or stagnant water. We couldn't find where it was coming from. "We can't stay," I said, my voice flat, my throat raw from fear. I started packing what we needed: water, some food, anything that could help us hike out of there. Ben, of course, insisted we give the RV one more try. Miraculously, after hours of tinkering, the engine sputtered and coughed to life. For a moment, hope surged through me, that maybe, just maybe, we could get out of there. But of course, it was short-lived. Within minutes, the engine died again, this time with a finality that felt like a death knell. That's when Connor finally lost it. "So we just wait here until that thing kills us," he yelled, his voice cracking. Ben barked at him to calm down, but Connor shoved past him and stormed out to the fire pit. I went after him, not wanting him to be alone. He stood there, tears streaming down his face, all that teenage bravado gone. Suddenly, Lily stumbled out of the RV, her eyes vacant again. She mumbled something about having to go to the lake, that the lady wanted her. Ben tried to comfort her, but she pushed him away, screaming in that horrible, guttural voice that wasn't hers. Connor grabbed her shoulders to steady her, and that's when a blast of icy wind slammed into him, throwing him backward. He fell against a cooler, wincing in pain. Lily sank to her knees, repeating that strange phrase over and over, like a chant. And then, right there, in broad daylight, the hag appeared. She stood at the lake shore, her skin chalky white, her hair stringy and matted with weeds. She tilted her head slowly, then fixed her gaze on Lily, who was struggling to stand up. Ben lunged forward, and another rush of freezing air hit him, knocking him flat on his back, breathless. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I don't know what made me do it. It was like something just clicked in my brain. I remembered Dave's photos, how obsessed he'd been with those symbols, how he believed they were connected to the lake spirit. I grabbed Dave's camera from under a bench seat in the RV. I found the photos he'd printed, grainy images of those ancient carvings. Without even thinking it through, I started throwing the photos into the dying campfire, one by one. The paper curled and blackened instantly. A shriek, high and piercing, ripped through the clearing. It didn't come from me or Lily or even Ben. It came from the hag. The temperature plummeted even further. The flames in the fire pit flared up, crackling and spitting sparks. Through the shimmering heat, I saw the hag stumble back from the water, her mouth twisted in silent fury. And then I saw something behind her, a figure, blurry and indistinct. It looked like Dave, but it wasn't really him, not anymore. It was like his shape was half dissolved, half ghostly, his eyes wide with unimaginable terror. My heart seized. For a split second, his form flickered, and then he vanished, leaving only a swirl of disturbed water in his place. The hag let out another inhuman shriek. Ben scrambled to his feet, pulling Lily away from the fire. Connor clutched his arm, which was scratched and bleeding from the fall, but he was determined to keep Lily safe. As the last photo disintegrated to ash, the hag thrashed her head back, emitting a sickening, watery groan. Then she turned, stumbled back into the lake, and dissolved beneath the ripples. We were left there, gasping in the eerie silence. No more wind, no more shrieks. But none of us believed we were safe. Not yet. I was still terrified that the hag might come back, stronger than ever. "We have to go," I choked out, picking up Lily, who now lay limp in my arms. She was breathing, but her eyes were closed. Ben nodded, his face pale. He tried the engine one last time, and, unbelievably, it turned over and roared to life. We scrambled inside, Ethan holding pressure on his bleeding arm, Mark frantically checking the mirrors. The moment the RV lurched forward, Lily started to stir. She gazed at me with frightened eyes, a flicker of her old self returning. We tore down that narrow dirt road at a reckless pace, every bump jarring us, but we didn't care. We just needed to put as much distance as possible between us and that cursed lake. We finally reached a paved road, and the smell of asphalt had never been so sweet. Mark refused to stop driving until we reached a small town about an hour away. There, under the neon glow of a gas station sign, we finally exhaled. I tried my phone, and by some miracle, I got just enough signal to call 911 and report Dave missing. It tore my heart in two to tell them the partial truth, that he disappeared near Willow Creek, and we had no idea where he was. We left out the hag, the chanting, the footprints vanishing in the water. Who would believe us, anyway? In the days and weeks that followed, I barely slept. Lily recovered physically, but she refused to talk about what she saw. Sometimes I catch her staring into space, her eyes glistening with tears. Ethan needed stitches for the gash on his arm, and while it's healed, it's left a long, angry scar that he touches absent-mindedly. Ben tries to put on a brave face, but I see the haunted look in his eyes when he thinks I'm not watching. Search parties combed the area, but they never found Dave or any trace of him, apart from those footprints near the lake. By all accounts, it was as though he vanished into thin air. Sometimes I dream of that final moment near the water. I see Dave's terrified face, see the hag pulling him down into the dark. I wake up drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, gripping the sheets with trembling hands. We keep telling ourselves that we did what we had to do. We survived. But there's a part of me that wonders if the hag still lingers, waiting, luring more souls into her icy grasp. Sometimes, just before falling asleep, I hear a faint, gurgling whisper in my ear. I tell myself it's just the echo of nightmares. And yet, a month after our escape, we were driving home from the grocery store. It was dusk and Lily was asleep in the back seat. Ethan had his headphones on. Ben squeezed my hand from the driver's seat, trying to comfort me. I glanced in the side view mirror, catching my reflection, and behind me, for just an instant, I thought I saw her. That pale face, those hollow eyes. She smiled a hideous smile with blackened teeth, and then sank away, disappearing as quickly as she'd appeared. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was real. All I know is that Willow Creek changed us forever. Dave never came back. That hag, that ancient spirit, left a wound in our family that will never truly heal. And every time I close my eyes, I hear the soft splash of water, the faintest whisper on the wind, reminding me that some things, some nightmares, refuse to stay buried. My name is Sarah Jenkins, I'm 38, and this whole mess started 2 years ago. We were supposed to be having this nice, relaxing family camping trip up in Glacier National Park. You know, fresh air bonding, all that good stuff. I haven't told anyone the whole story, not really. Honestly, who'd believe me? But I gotta get it out. Maybe writing it down will help me, or maybe I just need to warn people. Either way, here it goes. It was late October, and my husband, Ben, was totally stressed out from his engineering job. Our 15-year-old Ethan was being a typical teenager, all moody, locked in his room, and obsessed with these ghost hunting videos online. I figured a family trip was just what we needed, so we loaded up our beat-up old RV and headed for the mountains. Glacier was gorgeous. I mean, picture perfect. The leaves were turning gold, and there was snow on the peaks. But Ben, wanting to be all adventurous, he didn't want to go to the usual touristy spots. He found some cough trail, campsite on some online forum. It was way out there, but he swore he was a navigation whiz and, well, I trusted him. I did. Back then, anyway. The first day was actually pretty nice. We found this clearing surrounded by these huge pine trees and set up camp. Ethan was being a grump, as usual, with his headphones practically glued to his ears, but at least he wasn't on his phone 24/7. Ben built a fire, and we roasted marshmallows under the stars. It was one of those moments where you think, yeah, this is what it's all about. I actually felt hopeful, like maybe this trip would do us all some good. But that night, things started to get weird. I woke up in the middle of the night to this scratching sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, this slow, deliberate scratching, right outside the RV. I poked Ben awake, but he just mumbled, "It's probably a raccoon," and rolled over. I tried to tell myself he was right, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, though, I saw them claw marks, deep ones, on the side of the RV, way bigger than any raccoon could make. Ben just laughed it off, said it must have been a bear. But Ethan, he was all over it. He started snapping pictures and going on about Wendigos. "They're from Native American legends," he said, all excited. "They're like people who turn into monsters after eating human flesh toshed." "Okay, that's enough, Ethan," I said, trying to keep things from getting too out there. Ben just rolled his eyes and muttered something about kids these days. We decided to go for a hike that afternoon. I figured some fresh air might do us all some good, especially Ethan. The trail we took wasn't on the official park map, but Ben was all, "Don't worry, it loops back around." The woods were super quiet, it was kinda creepy. No birds, no squirrels, nothing, just the crunch of the snow under our feet. And Ethan kept wandering off the trail, being all curious. I kept yelling at him to stay with us, but he'd just shrug and say, "I thought I saw something." Teenagers, right? It wasn't until we tried to head back that we realized we were totally lost. The map was useless, and it was starting to get dark. Ben tried to act all calm and collected, but I could see he was starting to freak out. Ethan was whining about being cold, and I started to get this really bad feeling, like we were being watched. I kept thinking I saw something moving in the trees, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. We did eventually find our way back to the campsite, but it was pitch black by then and freezing cold. That night, the scratching came back, but this time it was louder, like whatever it was circling the RV. Ben grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check, but he didn't find anything. When he came back in, he was pale. "It's just the wind," he said, but he didn't sound so sure. And Ethan, he spent the whole night staring out the window, looking terrified. That's how it all started. Just a family trip that went completely off the rails. Little did I know, it was about to get a whole lot worse. The next day, things went from bad to worse. That's when we met her. Mallory. She was a college student, hiking by herself. She had this wild, curly red hair and a smile that seemed way too cheerful for those creepy woods. She acted all relieved to see us, said she was lost and needed directions. Ethan, being a teenage boy, instantly took a liking to her. He started peppering her with questions about her hiking gear and why she was out there alone. Mallory just laughed and said she liked the peace and quiet. We ended up having lunch with her. Instant ramen and trail mix gourmet, I know. That's when Mallory started talking about the local legends. "You ever heard of the Wendigo?" she asked, looking right at Ethan. My son, of course, was practically bouncing in his seat. He knew all about it from his weird videos. "It's a big one around here," Mallory continued. "A spirit of hunger, they say. Possesses people who get lost in the woods. Drives them to..." She trailed off, glancing at me. "Well, it's just an old story." "Just a story," Ben repeated, sounding annoyed. He clearly didn't like Mallory. I could tell he thought she was filling Ethan's head with nonsense. I mean, I wasn't exactly thrilled about the Wendigo talk either, but she seemed harmless enough. And honestly, Ethan was the most animated I'd seen him the whole trip. That night, though, things took a seriously dark turn. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan woke us up, freaking out. He said he heard someone calling his name. Ben, being Mr. Rational, said it was just a dream. But I saw the look in Ethan's eyes. He was genuinely scared. I went outside to check around the campsite, and that's when I saw them more footprints. Huge, like the claw marks from before, but different. These looked almost human, but with 5 toes, long and with these wicked claws. It didn't make any sense. The next morning, Ethan was gone. Just gone. His bed was empty, his boots were gone. I felt this wave of pure panic. We started screaming his name, our voices echoing through the silent woods. It was like a nightmare. Mallory, trying to be helpful, suggested we split up to cover more ground. But Ben was having none of it. "We stick together," he said, his voice hard. No room for argument. We followed Ethan's footprints, which led us deeper and deeper into the woods. It was weird, though. The tracks were all over the place, like he'd been running, maybe even in circles. Then, suddenly they just stopped. 1 minute there were footprints, the next, nothing. Just a patch of smooth, untouched snow. No signs of a struggle, no clue where he could have gone. It was like he vanished into thin air. Mallory found something nearby, a circle made of bones, arranged in this really creepy pattern. She went pale and started mumbling about rituals and ancient curses. Ben, in his infinite wisdom, started accusing her of knowing more than she was letting on. They got into this huge shouting match, right there in the middle of the woods, while our son was missing. I tried to break it up, but all I could think about was finding Ethan. As it started to get dark, the howling began. It was the most awful sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't like an animal, not really. It sounded almost human, but twisted, full of pain and hunger. We huddled around the dying campfire, scared out of our minds. And then we heard it, Ethan's voice, calling for help. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We shone our flashlights into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows, and that awful howling. Mallory was convinced it was something supernatural. She kept saying the Wendigo had taken Ethan. Ben wouldn't listen. He blamed her for putting those ideas in Ethan's head in the first place. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was we had to get out of there. We decided to make a run for the RV, but we didn't make it. That's when it attacked. It came out of the darkness so fast, we barely had time to react. It was huge, towering over us, with these long, skeletal limbs and eyes that glowed with an eerie light. It moved like lightning, knocking Ben to the ground. Mallory, she was amazing, actually. She grabbed a burning stick from the fire and swung it at the creature, giving us a chance to escape. She screamed at us to run, to get to the RV. I wanted to stay and help her, I really did, but Ben grabbed my arm and dragged me away. We ran through the woods like we were being chased by the devil himself. And you know what? Maybe we were. We made it back to the RV, and that's when we saw him. Ethan, he was sitting on the steps, pale and shivering, his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't explain where he'd been. He just kept saying he heard voices and followed them. I grabbed him and hugged him so tight. I thought I'd break him. I was so relieved, but also terrified. What had happened to him out there? And what about Mallory? We got out of there as fast as that old RV could go. We just drove, leaving Glacier and Mallory behind. I'll never forget her screams. I'll never forgive myself for not going back. But the worst part, the thing that really haunts me, is what happened to Ethan. He's not the same. He barely eats, and sometimes at night, I catch him staring out the window, his face looking all weird in the reflection. And his eyes. Sometimes when he thinks no one's looking, they glow, just like that thing in the woods. We brought something back with us from that trip. Something dark and hungry. And I'm scared, so scared, of what will happen when it finally takes over. We didn't stop driving until we were well clear of Montana. Ben was a wreck, his face all scratched up from where that thing had knocked him down. Ethan was just different. He hardly spoke, ate almost nothing, and kept having these nightmares. We tried to get him to talk about what happened, but he either couldn't or wouldn't. He'd just shake his head, his eyes wide and haunted, and whisper about the voices. We went to doctors, therapists, you name it. Nobody could explain what was wrong with him. They'd talk about PTSD, trauma, shock, but nothing seemed to fit. Deep down, I knew it was more than that. What we saw in those woods, what took Ethan, it wasn't something you could just explain away with psychology. Life became this weird, twisted version of normal. We tried to go back to our routines. Ben went back to work. I went back to my part-time job at the library. But it was like we were all just going through the motions, haunted by what happened. I'd catch Ben staring off into space, his face pale and drawn, and Ethan was fading away. He got skinnier, paler. He stopped going to school, stopped seeing his friends. He'd just sit in his room, staring out the window, especially at night. And then there were the eyes, that faint, eerie glow. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection, anything but what I knew it was. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went into Ethan's room and found him by the window, as usual. "Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you have to tell me what happened out there. What did you see?" He turned to me, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside, his eyes glowed brighter. It wasn't just a reflection. It was real. "It's hungry, Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's always hungry." "What's hungry, honey?" I asked, my heart breaking. "What are you talking about?" "The man in the woods," he said. "He wants to eat. He wants to eat everything." I tried to get him to explain, but that's all he would say. He just kept repeating those words over and over. "The man in the woods. He's hungry." It was like he was in a trance. Then things started to happen around the house. Small things at first. Food disappearing from the pantry, strange noises at night, a constant feeling of being watched. I'd find things moved around, furniture rearranged, like someone was pacing through the house while we slept. One morning, I woke up to find all the mirrors in the house covered with sheets. Ethan was standing in the hallway, his eyes wide and unfocused. "He doesn't like the mirrors," he mumbled. "He doesn't like to see himself." That's when I knew for sure. It wasn't just Ethan. Whatever had taken him in the woods, it had come back with him. It was in our house. Ben, of course, refused to believe it. He said I was being hysterical, that I was letting my imagination run wild. He blamed it on grief, on stress, on anything but the truth. But I knew. I saw it in Ethan's eyes, in the strange occurrences around the house, in the growing sense of dread that hung over us like a shroud. I started researching, spending hours online, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. I read about Native American legends, about skinwalkers and wendigos, about creatures that could steal your form, your soul. The more I read, the more terrified I became. Then, one night, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. It was Ben. I ran into the living room and found him on the floor, clutching his arm. He was pale, sweating, his eyes wide with terror. It bit me," he stammered, pointing to a wound on his arm. It looked like a human bite mark, but deeper, more savage. And in the corner of the room, I saw him. Ethan. He was standing there, his eyes glowing, a faint smile on his lips. But it wasn't Ethan, not really. It was something else, something wearing his skin. "He's hungry, Mom," he said, his voice a chilling mix of Ethan's and something else, something ancient and monstrous. "And he's tired of waiting." Ben was never the same after that. The bite wound became infected, started rotting away. He was constantly sick and weak, lost weight at an alarming rate. But the doctors could not find anything wrong. Ben started to change. became more aggressive and angry all the time, until finally he had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. The doctors thought he was delusional. He kept saying that Ethan was not his son. That's when I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let that thing destroy our family. I had to find a way to save my son, to get him back. But how do you fight something you don't understand? Something that can hide in plain sight, wearing the face of someone you love. I was losing hope until I found something in my research. An old ritual, a way to banish a Wendigo. It was dangerous, terrifying, but it was the only chance I had. The ritual was my last hope, my only hope. I found it in some obscure, dusty old book about Native American folklore, tucked away in the back of the library where I worked. It was terrifying, dangerous, and involved things I didn't fully understand. But I was desperate. That thing wearing my son's skin was getting stronger, and I was running out of time. The ritual required specific items: sage, cedar, a raven's feather, and, most importantly, a piece of the Wendigo's true form. The book said it was a banishment, a way to force the spirit back to where it came from. It sounded insane, but what other choice did I have? Getting the ingredients was the easy part. The hard part was getting close enough to Ethan, to that thing, to get what I needed. It was always watching, always lurking. But I had to try. I waited until night, when it seemed most active. I found Ethan in the living room, staring out the window at the darkness. His eyes were glowing, that eerie, unsettling light. He didn't even seem to notice me at first. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "I know you're in there. I know you're fighting." It turned its head, slowly, and looked at me. A flicker of something that might have been Ethan crossed its face, but it was quickly gone, replaced by that cold, hungry stare. "He's gone, Mom," it said, its voice a chilling rasp. "There's only me now." This was my chance. I lunged forward, grabbing a handful of its hair. It reacted instantly, a snarl ripping from its throat. It was strong, impossibly strong, and it threw me across the room like a rag doll. But I held on, clutching the hair in my fist. I'd gotten what I needed. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the basement, where I'd prepared everything for the ritual. I lit the sage and cedar, the smoke filling the small space, thick and fragrant. I placed the raven's feather in the center of the circle I'd drawn on the floor, following the instructions in the book. Then, with shaking hands, I added the hair, Ethan's hair, or what was once his. As soon as the hair touched the other ingredients, the room grew cold. The air crackled with energy. I started chanting the words from the book, a strange, guttural language I didn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. The basement door slammed open, and it stood there, silhouetted against the light from upstairs. Its eyes burned with fury. "You can't stop me," it hissed. "He's mine now. He's my son," I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. "And I'm taking him back." I continued chanting, the words tumbling from my lips faster and faster. The smoke from the sage and cedar swirled around me, thick and choking. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The creature started to advance, its movements jerky and unnatural, but the circle seemed to hold it back. It snarled and hissed, its body contorting in pain. Then, I saw him. Ethan. For a moment, The creature's face flickered, and I saw my son's face, terrified and pleading. "Help me, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That was all the encouragement I needed. I poured all my love, all my fear, all my hope into the chant. The words echoed through the basement, growing louder and louder, until they were a deafening roar. The creature shrieked a sound of pure agony. Its body began to flicker like a bad hologram. The glowing eyes dimmed. Then, with a final, ear-splitting shriek, it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke, which was quickly sucked into the center of the circle, vanishing as if it had never been there. Silence. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, my body trembling. The smoke cleared, and I saw him. Ethan. He was lying on the floor, unconscious, but breathing. I crawled to him, tears streaming down my face. I cradled him in my arms, rocking him back and forth. "It's okay, baby," I whispered. "It's over. It's gone." He woke up slowly, his eyes dazed and confused. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. "Mom," he asked, his voice weak. "I'm here, baby," I said, sobbing with relief. "I'm here." It took a long time for Ethan to recover. He had no memory of what happened after he disappeared in the woods. The doctors called it a miracle, a case of extreme amnesia brought on by trauma. But I knew the truth. We moved away after that, far away from Montana, from Glacier National Park, from the memory of those terrifying woods. We started over in a small town by the coast, where the air was clean and the sun shone bright. Ethan got better. He went back to school, made friends, started living a normal life again. But sometimes I'd catch him staring out at the ocean, a faraway look in his eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the memory of that creature, of the hunger in its eyes. I don't know if we'll ever truly be free from what happened in those woods. I don't know if the Wendigo is really gone, or if it's just waiting, biding its time. But I do know this: I'll never forget the terror, the helplessness, the feeling of losing my son to something I couldn't understand. And I'll always be watching, always listening, for the sound of scratching at the door, for the glow of hungry eyes in the darkness. Because some things, some horrors, they stay with you, buried deep inside, waiting for their chance to return. And all you can do is be ready to fight, to protect the ones you love, even from the monsters that hide within. The wilderness is full of them, and sometimes they follow you home,